William Moffett Sr. was born February 1st, 1762, in St. Field Downs, Ireland, Ulster. He died April 22nd, 1826, at his home in Bath County, Kentucky. William's wife was Rebecca Robinson. She was born January 22nd, 1764, in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. Rebecca was the second generation to be born in the colonies before they were the United States. Rebecca Robinson Moffett died July 2nd, 1843, in what had become Sharpsburg, Kentucky. To truly grasp the depth of my story, we need to journey far back, long before the first Moffetts and Trimbles ever set eyes on the wild, untamed shores of the New World. Picture this: a time when America didn't yet exist as a nation, when the colonies were mere dreams on distant horizons, and the land that would become the United States was still a vast, uncharted frontier of forests, rivers, and possibility. My roots stretch even further, back across the stormy Atlantic to the rugged Scottish borders and the misty hills of Dumfriesshire, where the Moffetts or Moffats first took their name from the long, sweeping plain of Moffat in Annandale, and to the ancient border clans of Scotland, where the Trimbles, kin to the storied Turnbulls, earned their fierce reputation twisting the horns of wild bulls and standing firm amid the lawless reaving lands. These were the eras of clan feuds, border raids, and hardy folk who carved lives from stone and heather, centuries before any ship carried our ancestors toward the promise and peril of a new continent. Only by stepping into that distant, wind-swept past can we begin to understand the blood, grit, and unyielding spirit that eventually crossed oceans and shaped the American chapter of the Moffett and Trimble saga. In the rolling green hills of County Down, Northern Ireland, lies the small town of Suntfield, a quiet place today. But in the 1780s it beat with the restless heart of Ulster, the ancient province of 9 counties: Antrim, Armagh, Cavan, Derry, Donegal, Down, Fermanagh, Monaghan, and Tyrone. County Down has always stood at the very core of Ulster, its boundaries unchanged through centuries of storm and settlement. Here, in the shadow of the 18th century, 2 families, the Trimbles and the Moffetts, wove their fates together in ways that would echo across oceans and generations. Both descended from the hardy lowland Scots of the Turnbull and Moffett clans. They had crossed the narrow sea during the great plantation of Ulster, planting themselves in the soil of Down and Antrim, in places like Tullindany. Presbyterian to the bone, they found common ground in the same stone kirks, the same shared sermons, the same hard-won community gatherings that bound them closer than blood alone ever could. Over more than a century, through baptisms, weddings, and funerals, the Moffetts, Trimbles, and their allied Douglases became intertwined. Clans fused not by royal decree, but by shared faith, shared hardship, and shared songs. They carried with them the old Scottish ways, the knowledge of flax and linen, the craft of fortified farmhouses that could withstand both weather and raiders, the music of fiddle and pipes that still lingers in Ulster's memory. Their speech blended the rolling cadence of Scots English with the lilt of the Irish countryside, giving birth to a distinctive Ulster Scots tongue, rich with its own poetry, ballads, and folklore. Yet beneath the surface of community and survival ran a darker current. By the 1700s, the promise of the plantation had curdled. Landlords, some Scots themselves, began to rack rent their tenants, doubling and tripling leases until even the most industrious families could no longer breathe. Eviction came swiftly, homes were tumbled, and the spectre of hunger stalked the land. Sectarian laws lingered like old wounds. Presbyterians were forced to pay tithes to support the Anglican church they did not attend, barred from public office, and treated as second-class subjects in the land they had helped build. Famine, poor harvests, and the weight of unpayable debt pressed down harder with each passing year, and so, around 1700, the great Ulster to Scots exodus began. Not driven by targeted religious persecution alone, but by a grinding combination of economic strangulation and lingering discrimination. Families sold what they owned, packed their Bibles and their hopes, and set sail for America, drawn by the promise of land they could truly call their own. What follows is the story of two such families, the Trimbles and the Moffetts, whose lives were shaped by these forces, whose paths crossed in Ulster's kirks and fields, and whose descendants carried those intertwined roots across the Atlantic to the wild new frontier of Kentucky. Their tale is one of endurance, faith, betrayal, and unbreakable bonds, blood ties that time and distance could never fully sever, yet broken clans that still bear the scars of the old country they left behind. Turn the page. Their story, and ours, begins now.
The 26th of April, in the year 1826, the relentless tick of the clock sliced through silence, filling the heavy air of the house with a steady heartbeat. Each second carried the weight of William's diminishing breaths, rattling out like dry corn shaking in an autumn breeze. It was hard to believe he was truly leaving us. Everything we had forged together, every struggle, now only a memory, from our first meeting to dreams of prosperous farms and homesteads. William Moffett Sr. died as he had lived, a rifle ball pressed deep in his pocket. He lived his last days on his own terms, with a cough that rattled his ribs with cruel insistence. The will. Monday, April 24th, 1826, 11 a.m. The lawyer's voice crept into the loom house, lingering with the faint lanolin scent of raw wool Rebecca had carded earlier that morning. I give to my dear and loving wife, my Negro slaves, except the two girls, Emily and Amanda. Outside, the spring house whispered the cold tears of rain onto the April earth. The grandchildren shifted uneasily. They knew the stories. The gunshot ringing through the canyon at Green River Ford, the steady stare that repelled Richard Henderson's land sharks. But now, the farm was carved up like the ledger in front of them, acres divided, slaves parceled like livestock. The task felt heavier than any old ballad ever sung. Rebecca did not cry. At 61, her hands remained hardened from decades of salt milling. Flax breaking had become abandoned long ago. She watched the lawyer's lips move. One bed and bedding. One cow and calf. And her mind drifted back to 1785. The warm glow of a Harrisburg hearth lit a young bride as she stitched her blue linsey-woolsey wedding dress, unaware of the years and burdens to come. The day after William's burial, the house sat hushed, except for the solemn tick of the case clock and a distant dog's bark near the corn crib. 34 family members had ebbed in and out like tidewater, leaving the farm as hollow as breath caught in winter air. Rebecca moved deliberately, the barn loft's straw and fodder still carrying faint scents of sheep and fond memories of children playing. She opened the drawer of William's worn writing desk, the ink-dried nib, now rust-stained and fragile. Beneath the ledger, a faded linen seed pouch cradled a silver thimble smooth and cool in the pale window light. The faint engraving caught her eye. Trimble's goods, from her uncle's Belfast shop. William kept it not for sewing, but as a weight to carry quietly. Rebecca sank into the high-backed chair, pressing the thimble to her lips like a benediction. You build what you can, and bury the rest.
Appendix: Moffett Estate, Outbuildings, 1826. A barn's shelter for livestock and grain. Smokehouse, meat curing in a cool shadow. Loom house, wool spun from 72 sheep. Kitchen house, meals made at distance. Spring house, water cooled now in stone silence. slave quarters, cabins for those owned, corn crib, golden kernels drying, storing, chicken coop, fowl clucking beneath the eaves, blacksmith shop, metal struck and bent into tools. The family slept in the main house, enslaved workers in cabins, hired men in lofts. Each day's labor included crop rotation, butchering, salt curing, beehives, livestock tending, butter and vinegar making, meals cooked, grains milled, loom worked, and wools. Spun for sale, this supplies the estate for barter and wagon sales. Bartering ruled the land. No tobacco, no flax, only what survived. By dusk, the case clock still kept its measured tick, counting out a house that no longer belonged to William. Its tick threaded through barn and smokehouse, loom house and spring house, cabins and corn crib, touching every board William had raised. Rebecca set the thimble back in its pouch, now hearing only her own breath. You build what you can and bury the rest. William built this farm, now it belongs to James.
Philadelphia, 1786. Returning from Belfast, 41 years earlier. After a hard 3-month Atlantic crossing from the crowded quays of Belfast, Rebecca's judgment stood vindicated. No longer merely a fondly remembered niece before her uncles, John and Michael Trimble of Trimble Goods, she now commanded their attention as a serious partner. She spoke with ease of tariffs and shipping tonnage, of projections, margins, and quality grades, her ledgers tracing the yield of the Harrisburg flax fields in a steady, confident hand that earned their respect. Impressed, Uncle John pressed a small stack of engraved thimbles into her palm. Tokens. For the fine work, he said. To Rebecca, they were more than tools of the trade. They were emblems of precision and commercial honor, touchstones she would carry with them into the wild, uncharted reaches of Kentucky. They would return to Philadelphia with a hold full of top-quality linen, a high-value commodity for the city's discerning market. Flax was in high demand. Most fiber came from the Baltic regions, yet Europe also depended on American supplies to meet its needs. Flax and hemp were especially sought after for making sailcloth, cordage, and linen. Belfast's linen exports couldn't keep pace with the colony's growing population. Flaxseed ranked as Pennsylvania's third-largest export in 1785, with most shipments going to Dublin, leaving Belfast reliant on brokered seed from Dublin or costlier imports from the Baltic region. Rebecca and William found their niche by securing better prices without competing in Dublin's crowded market. These flaxseeds were essential. Irish farmers pulled flax plants young to produce the finest, longest fibers for premium linen, exhausting the soiled seed supply each season. Philadelphia, 1786, the return. After 12 grueling weeks on the Atlantic, the two-masted merchant brig Hibernian finally eased into the broad mouth of the Delaware River, her hull groaning with relief as the open ocean's wild swells gave way to the river's steadier, silken current. Down in the dim hold where Rebecca and William had spent so many long days and nights, the world felt transformed. The constant, bone-deep creak of oak timbers, once a frantic protesting symphony against pounding waves, now softened to a low rhythmic murmur, like an old house settling after a storm. Water no longer rushed and slapped violently against the hull. Instead it lapped gently, a steady, soothing hush that whispered along the planking just inches from their hammocks. The air below decks, thick and stale for weeks with the sour reek of unwashed bodies, stagnate bilge water, salt-soaked wool, and the stench of seasickness began to shift. A faint, briny freshness seeped down the companionway hatch, carrying hints of river mud, distant aroma of meats roasting, bakeries, and something greener, land itself. From above came the sudden explosion of activity on deck. Bare feet slapped across planks in urgent rhythm. Ropes hissed through blocks with sharp squeaks. Heavy blocks thudded against masts as sails were furled. Voices barked orders in thick accents. Irish, English, Scots, and even a few German tones, mingling with the clank of chains paying out, the deep thud of anchors splashing into the water, and the rhythmic creak of capstans as men heaved the ship toward the docks. The giant sails snapped once, twice, then fell silent. The ship slowed, swayed gently, and bumped softly against wooden pilings with a low, resonant thump that vibrated through every beam. Rebecca pressed close to one of the cannon portholes, its opening just large enough to frame the growing city. Through it, Philadelphia unfolded like a promise kept, a forest of masts stretching toward the horizon. Tilting against the sky, brick warehouses crowding the wharves like weary sentinels, their dark windows catching sharp glints from the early morning sun, now rising in the east. Church steeples pierced the skyline. Christ Church, the State House, familiar landmarks. Smoke from countless chimneys rose in lazy columns, carrying the scent of burning coal and baking bread down to the river. Gulls wheeled overhead in white flashes, their harsh, piercing cries slicing through the sounds of the city. On deck, the fresh river breeze swept away the last traces of ocean salt, but it brought unwelcome smells in their place, the heavy, oily bite of hot tar being applied to rigging, the sharp, earthy stink of horse dung from waiting carts on the wharf, the warm, musky sweat of dockworkers shouting and hauling ropes, and the sweet, rotting undertone of low tide, where exposed mud and decaying fish mingled with the faint sweetness of spilled molasses from nearby barrels. The air turned thick, almost chewable, tar, manure, human exertion, river rot, all layered over the lingering salt that clung to skin and clothing like a second hide. William stood beside her at the porthole, his calloused hand resting on the damp wood frame. The touch of solid land so near made his fingers tingle. After weeks of endless rocking, the gentle sway now felt almost still. Rebecca tasted salt on her lips, not just from the sea, but from tears of exhaustion and quiet triumph. The hold, once a prison of endless motion and misery, now echoed with the promise of solid ground, new beginnings, and the distant clamour of a city alive with opportunity. As the gangplank thudded into place, and the first crates began to scrape across the deck above, Rebecca and William stepped toward the ladder, hearts pounding with the same anxious rhythm they'd felt back in Harrisburg before leaving for this journey. Belfast and the Atlantic had tested them. Now Philadelphia awaited, noisy, fragrant, and brimming with the unknown. A drover's cart rattled past, wheels spitting mud, a loose sow darted between the horses, and the driver cursed in 3 languages at once. William now stood on the wharf plank, still warm from the morning sun, and felt the old Ulster anger rise in his throat. This was the place men called the cradle of liberty, yet every brick seemed laid on someone else's back. Rebecca came to his side, shawl drawn tight, though the day was mild. Her eyes, green, sharp, fearless, took in the same chaos and saw something different. Possibility. Making his way across the wharf, the Atlantic's phantom sway lingered in his bones. As Rebecca would say in her steady voice, the real work had scarcely begun. Yet the true weight he carried wasn't the job ahead. It was the memory left behind in Ulster, the sadness of his mother's and father's last embrace and their Belfast farewell, a silent debt. This entire venture pulsed with the shrewd heart of the women in his life. It was Rebecca's mother, Margaret, who had brokered the connection, and Rebecca's uncle John Trimble, the Belfast merchant, who had turned their Harrisburg flaxseed into a cargo of fine Irish linen. Their crates, 32 of them, stenciled Trimble goods in fresh black paint, had just been swung down from the Belfast packet by a crane that creaked like an old man's bones. The linen inside was worth more than William's father had seen in 20 years of rent-paying. Part of the profit had already been handed over in silver before they sailed, enough to pay their passage, enough to leave a small, bright weight of coin sewn inside Rebecca's petticoat and in William's belt. Their stake, their first true coin of freedom. The linen sale would reclaim the silver that had paid their passage and cede the purse for Kentucky land. In Belfast, John and Michael Trimble had been clear. They found value in the couple, his strength of negotiation, his presence for security, and a greater use for Rebecca, her ledger skills, her quick mind for numbers and correspondence. They offered a wage, a fixed role in transatlantic trade. Security. "Stay with us," John had said, clapping William on the shoulder. "Strong back, quick mind, honest name. We'll make ye a partner inside 2 years. Second house on the Antrim Road, wages steady as the tide. It sounded like a rescue. A life built on trade instead of landlords. No more watching the harvest like his parents, seeing it go to pay rent on land that his father would never own. Yet as William glared at the sweating stevedores, at the merchants in fine coats shouting numbers, at the black men in chains being marched past to a ship bound south, he felt the old trap closing again. Wages were only rent paid by the week, something you could never call your own. Another man's ledger, another man's roof, the same slow death his father was living, shackled to servitude and poverty, only with cleaner boots. No more, he vowed, the words hardening within him like hammered steel. No more. Rebecca's hand found his arm, her touch a gentle anchor in the maelstrom. She said nothing, but her silence was a question. She had heard Trimble's offer, had calculated its safety in the columns of her mind. Rebecca read his face the way she read everything, quick, unflinching. "We are not staying," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "This silver is seed, William, not salary. We plant it in Kentucky soil, not in Trimble warehouses." She thanked her uncles for the offer, but said they had other ventures planned in the New World. William looked from the crates of linen, their value measured in someone else's ledger, to Rebecca's steady, expectant gaze. The safe path was clear. The righteous one was a terrifying blank on the map. A chill sank deep into his bones, colder than the river wind. This was not just a landing, it was a choosing. The lobsters came first. William walked down the gangplank of the packet brig Hibernian, a 2-masted vessel with square sails, designed for both speed and cargo. The ship stood among a forest of masts, its hull weathered by Atlantic crossings and its rigging taut from recent repairs. William's legs shaking from the long trip, the ground seemed to move beneath him as he looked into a world of clawed creatures and chaos. The docks loaded with crates of lobsters, reeked of fish guts and tar, molasses sweating in barrels, rum stacked on the pier, and the body odor of men who'd crossed an ocean. A fisherman shoved a thrashing lobster toward him, its claws snapping in the air, its antennae quivering like some devil's whiskers. The fisherman called, "Oi, you! Hey, you! There!" Startled, William barked, responding to the fisherman, his Scots brogue sharp as flint. "Take your wee crawlers away." "I'm no eating nae filthy beasties, not when there's bannocks in my sack." The man laughed, revealing a mouthful of rotted teeth, and tossed the thing back into his crate. He and Rebecca would make this delivery, take the coin owed them, and be done with it. His own land was waiting. He made his way past the red brick warehouses along the Delaware, their weathered walls speaking of both trade and hard times, the windows winking like liars in the morning sun. Sailors in salt-stained shirts heaved at casks and bales, prime exports of tobacco and flax, colonial grown to patch Europe's threadbare fields. Horses and carts rattled over the ruts in the cobbles along the riverfront, cutting through the clamour of haggling merchants and creaking hulls. He lingered by a tavern, where the signboard swung on rusted hinges. Through the open door came the reek of ale and unwashed bodies. A lone fiddle shrieked and wailed, its high, raw notes slicing the smoky air like a hot blade. In one corner, a gentleman in a powdered wig and brown square-cut frock of the Georgian fashion jabbed his finger at a weathered farmer in homespun, the two of them shouting over the dead articles and the proposed new constitution, while pewter mugs rattled on the boards around them. His gut twisted, slow and hard. He had not left the bitter Ulster fields and the heavy taxes of Ireland only to be mired again in men's grasping ways. He had crossed to this new world to shake off crowns and landlords, to be rid of greedy lords and their lies, of persecution and endless levies and thin promises. Yet here it all stood again, dressed in new words, wearing another face. The same hunger, the same game. Damn them all, he thought. Damn them all if the new world must be raised on the same rotten stone. He had not chosen Kentucky in order to kneel, neither to kings nor to city gentlemen in powdered wigs who had never felt the bite of a plough in their hands. What he wanted was plain enough, freedom above all. Not the sort proclaimed in broadsides or toasted in parlours, but the kind a man bled for, earned with cracked hands and loaded rifles. For William, Land itself was the promise. Not borrowed land, not parcels marked out by men with pens and maps, but claimed, cut from the wild, fought for and held. Soil he might dig and sow and leave to his sons. That was the bargain. That was the dream. William mused that he would not hew out a life on the raw edge of the wilderness, only to have his measure taken by men who reckoned liberty in ink and impost. If this were truly to be a new world, then let it be new indeed, and not merely another empire cloaked in homespun. The ordinary on Front Street stank like a wet dog that had rolled in sour mash, spilled rum, damp wool, the smell of blood from a fresh, bloody nose in the corner, and the rotten reek of last week's whiskey sunk into the floorboards. A single whale oil lamp swung overhead, throwing greasy shadows across the low beams. Every breath tasted of smoke, sweat, and the bite of new distilled rye. When William stepped inside, the noise struck him first, a roar of German Gaelic and Yankee voices, the clatter of bone dice, the wet slap of cards on oak. Then he saw the quarrel. The tavern keeper, red as a freshly flayed hide, was leaning across his own bar, one thick finger stabbing the air at a tall, raw-boned man in a blue wool frock and worn, three-cornered hat. The tavern keeper yelling, "Overholt! 32 gallons short, Overholt! 32!" The man bellowed. "My customers cannot drink air, and I paid for whiskey." The distiller, Abraham Overholt, as William learned in the next breath, stood rigid, his knuckles white around the brim of his hat. The room bent inward about them, hungry for sport. William felt the old Ulster wariness stir in his chest, but with it came another voice, Rebecca's, quiet as Belfast rain. A quarrel, she would say, was only a need wearing a loud frock. He moved before the thought had quite taken shape. "Mr. Overholt," he said softly, stepping between them, close enough to catch the sharp corn mash on the distiller's breath. "William Moffett, late of Harrisburg. Might I have a word?" Overholt's pale, bloodshot, honest eyes flicked to him, weighing him. William held the gaze as he always did, as though he might look clean through to the man's marrow. They went to a corner table still sticky with last night's flip. A candle, a single tallow dip guttered between them, giving off the stink of hot fat and singed wick. "I watched good rye spill from bad staves all the way up the Delaware from Belfast," William began, his voice low and measured. "Abraham, if I may, Robinson's cooperage in Harrisburg has white oak cut on the ridge above the river, air-seasoned 2 full years and sawn on our own mill. 6 iron hoops to every hogshead, not 4, bung in the centre, tight as a drum. I can have the first 10 on your wharf within a fortnight, river willing." Overholt's shoulders eased a shade. "And your price?" William leaned in, repeating the name as if sealing it. "Abraham, I'll not flay a man already bleeding. You pay me a share of what the whiskey is worth when it reaches the glass, not what it spills on the ground. We divide the savings between us. My word on it, no lawyer's paper, no great man's seal." Overholt gave a short, wondering laugh. "You put faith in a handshake." "I do," William said, "in a man who looks me in the eye when he gives it." Just then a new voice cut across them, smooth as silk and scented with pomatum and privilege. A gentleman in silver-buckled shoes and a bag-wig powdered like fresh flour eased himself between them, smiling like a cat. "Mr. Overholt," he purred, "surely you will not trade with some bog-trotting cooper when my friends upon the council might lighten your excise for a modest consideration in your business?" William turned slowly. The lamplight carved hard lines in the stranger's painted face. Something inside William, something forged in Ulster nights of writs and evictions, went very cold and very still. "Sir," he said, the words plunging cold and deliberate, "your word means nothing when it's bought with paper promises and Pennsylvania notes that melt away like May snow. I've watched men like you before, powdered and perfumed, swearing grandly, however, sir, your promise as empty as a spent purse." The wigged man flushed to the roots. Insolent Mick. But William had already turned back to Overholt, calm as winter iron. "Abraham, the casks will be on the wharf within a fortnight. You will not find me in this tavern again. I will not drink where a man's honour is sold by the gill." Overholt looked from the gentleman's retreating back to the young Ulsterman still holding his gaze, steady as any gamester. Then he reached across the table and took William's hand, stained with oak tannin, warm with life. "Done, William Moffett. My word for yours." Outside, the September wind off the Delaware carried the smell of pine tar and river, and the foul breath of the city's miasmas. William stepped into it with the weight of silver in his pocket from Rebecca's linen, and now the weight of something heavier, the first link in a chain he and Rebecca would forge with their own hands. Let Philadelphia quarrel as it pleased over constitutions and coin. He and Rebecca had just bought their first share of the future, with no more than a name spoken twice, a steady eye, and a handshake across a scarred tavern board. They were no longer floundering. They were building a business. The morning air quivered with salt and tar as William made his way back to the Hibernian, the creak of timbers and the slap of water against the hull rising around the great ship. His gaze fixed on the dark hold's door. He saw movement, a pale hand first, then an arm, and at last the weary slope of Rebecca's shoulders as she emerged from the ship's dim belly. The sunlight hit her like a living force. It spilled across her face beneath the bonnet, reflecting off the faint sheen of sweat and dust that weeks below deck had left behind. The smell of the harbour was all around her, brine, pitch, and the faint sweet rot of drying seaweed. After 12 weeks on the ocean, breathing the stale air of the hold, the breeze drifting from Delaware Bay up the river was welcome in its freshness. She blinked hard, flinching at the brilliance, and drew her worn leather satchel tight to her chest. She held her arm high as though the light itself were something she needed to ward off. Her eyes, squinting, showing a tumult of exhaust and wonder, tried to make sense of the chaos. She darted from the lobstermen with their thrashing, clawed creatures to the shimmering nets full of bluefish and haddock piled like stolen silver on the docks. The air pressed in around her, heavy with salt, smells of fish. It was that haze of rot and brine that clung to her tongue. Gulls shrieked above the masts, their wings tangled in frenzy fighting for fish scraps as carts rattled across the cobbles. The noise and motion of the harbour seemed a single living thing, restless and unrelenting. She stood in the midst of it, still and hollow with fatigue, as if her body had arrived but her spirit lagged somewhere far behind. Another reminder of how far she was from Harrisburg. Her fingers tightened around the worn satchel at her chest, the only fragment of her life that felt real amid the pandemonium. Rebecca's gaze was fixed on their wagon as it was winched onto the dock, its spokes twisted from the relentless sea damp. "We'll need a wheelwright," she said, her voice stripped of all inflection. It was not a complaint, but a cold statement of fact, the first item on a long ledger of survival. William turned his head and spat into the Delaware. The brown water accepted his bitterness without a ripple. "Aye," he grunted. "See if you can find us a roof. I'll see to the wagon and the horseflesh." She would secure the shelter. He would secure the means to leave it. The lobsters came first, claws snapping in their crates as if to warn that this new world would bite like the old. City men might swarm and quarrel over coin and favour. William and Rebecca would build something quieter and harder won, stave by stave, handshake by handshake. Miller's wheelwright and wagon yard, late afternoon, 1786. William Moffett pulled his coat tighter against the late September wind, the first hints of autumn edging the day's warmth. The dust of the wagon yard clung to his boots as he crossed toward the wheelwright's shed, the air thick with the smell of oil and iron. At the fence, a string of weary horses stood tethered, heads low and ribs showing. None looked worth the coin he kept hidden in his belt. A grizzled man in a leather apron, the smith, no doubt, leaned on a hammer and squinted at him through a haze of his pipe smoke. "You looking to buy or patch up?" The smith called, voice rough as gravel. "Both, "If you've the men for it," William answered, tipping his hat. The smith spat into the dirt and jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Wagon right's inside. Name's Miller. He'll fix your rig if it ain't broke in two." His eyes narrowed, measuring. "Horse'll cost you, though. Good stock's gone west already. Got a bay yonder stout. Not pretty." William stepped closer to the fence. The Conestoga bay was thick-bodied, scarred at the hocks but steady-eyed. Not a racer, but it looked like it could pull a loaded wagon through the devil's own country. "What are you asking?" William said, low and careful. The smith shrugged. $12 if you ain't too choosy. 10 if you pay coin now and ride before sunup." William considered. $12 was dear, but a broken horse or a broken axle between here and the Harrisburg could be a death sentence. He nodded once. "I'll see Miller about the wagon. If he says the wheels'll hold, you'll have your money by evening." The smith grinned, a gap-toothed, knowing smile. "Westward, eh? Best patch what you can, friend. Past the mountains, it's just the good Lord and your own luck. Philadelphia, last week of September 1786. Rebecca secured lodging for the night at a local ordinary. The man full of trouble, which kept separate quarters for traveling families, both men and women. It stood at the corner of Spruce and Water Streets, the very place she and William were to meet once he returned from having the wagon repaired and delivering the linen from the Hibernian to its buyer. The signboard creaked overhead as the wind off the Delaware came driving up the street. The public room was no place for a woman, thick with the smell of ale-soaked wool, pipe smoke, and the sharp sweetness of spilled port that the innkeeper was mopping from the dark-stained floorboards. Yet the common room was quieter than most, for the keeper's wife held firm rules for the house: no women of the town, no gaming, no hats, no mud-caked boots, and especially none of it on the Sabbath. For respectable travelers of mixed company, there were 4 small chambers above. Below, men might drink and talk politics, while above, wives and daughters could sleep without fear of being taken for what they were not. Rebecca had taken the corner chamber with its sloping ceiling and single dormer window that looked east over the Delaware. The bed was narrow, with a second truckle bed along the opposite wall, a chair, and a pair of hanging candles fit for reading. A neat patchwork quilt lay over the bed, freshly laundered, and a new iron latch fastened the door. She had paid an extra shilling for the privilege, and thought it money well laid out. The room opened onto a flagstone passage that divided the men's ordinary from the women's stair. There she met a kind woman, Martha Jane McAllister. Coming from the kitchen, and wiping flour from her hands upon her apron, she had been helping the keeper's wife roll pie crusts in exchange for an extra blanket. The common dining room was warm and close, lit by 2 tallow candles and the red glow of the coal fire on the hearth. A plain deal table stood in the midst, already laid with wooden bowls, and a loaf of bread still steaming from the oven. William came in at the appointed time. Rebecca laughed that he was never late for supper. She presented him to Martha Jane, a sturdy, robust woman of some 35 years, with fine brown hair and sensible brown eyes, a capable, industrious housewife well suited to the hardships of the frontier. William turned to Rebecca and said it was well she had found a friend in her waiting. Then the doorframe filled with the breadth of Martha's husband, Samuel McAllister, come to join them at table. Tall, a head taller than most men, he was muscular, broad across the shoulders as a door he was standing, hands that might bend iron, yet he was moving gently as he took Rebecca's fingers and bowed over them. Speaking low, lest his voice carry up the narrow stair, he asked, "And whom have we the pleasure of joining for supper?" Rebecca rose and fetched another plate to the board, and Samuel drew out a bench for her with the careful civility he might have shown a duchess. He reached across to take William's hand. "Samuel McAllister," he said, blacksmith by trade. William gave his own name in turn. Samuel's clasp was firm and final, his palm rough as granite, and his cold, flinty blue eyes met William's without wavering, the look of a man who knew his purpose and would not be turned from it. "So then, William," Samuel asked, "what brings ye to Philadelphia?" Rebecca answered first, saying they had lately come back from Belfast and were now bound again for Harrisburg after finishing their business in the city. "And what brings Martha and yourself?" she asked. Martha took up the tale. They had come from Boston and meant to remove to the frontier, to Kentucky if God allowed. Samuel added that smiths would be in great demand there. "Well then," William said, "we share something of the same bent. There is a wedding to be kept in February, but after that we too look to cross the Cumberland Gap and follow the great wagon road." Rebecca told Samuel how thankful she was to have found Martha Jane's friendly face upon the road, and asked when they meant to travel, and by which road. Samuel replied that folk told them the spring after the thaw was best, though the wilderness road would be muddy and stony and choked with wagons. Samuel glanced at William, then went on. "I was introduced at the Kirk, the old button-willowed church on High Street, to a man named Andrew Ellicott. A surveyor he is, and a thoughtful one. He was laying out the lines for the new church, measuring angles and distances with that quiet precision men of his trade carry like a second skin." He paused, letting the names settle. "Ellicott's no common traveller. He's been commissioned by the Commonwealth to survey improvements to the old Forbes road widening traces, marking better passes through the Alleghanies, perhaps even new cuts for wagons bound toward the Ohio country." Samuel leaned in slightly, his voice low with purpose. "He's leading a party of his own kin next spring, planning to go by the Forbes Road, past Carlisle to Fort Pitt, and then down the Ohio. He's got men waiting at Redstone, a boat-building hub on the Monongahela, and from there they'll float the river all the way to Limestone, near the mouth of the Kentucky." He looked William straight in the eye. "I'm to meet Andrew at the City Tavern this evening. You'd be welcome to join us, William. It's a house for prominent men, congressmen, lawyers, and men of business, who talk of the Republic, of laws, of roads and rivers, and of what lies beyond the mountains. And I make no doubt Martha Jane will enjoy your good lady's company while we hear what Andrew can tell us of our choices." William looked to Rebecca. She answered that he should go, that she would be quite safe in such company. He turned back to Samuel with a smile and said it seemed they had something worth sharing over a tankard of ale. Later, William and Samuel set out to meet Andrew, making their way along the cobbled streets to the famous City Tavern, a world apart from the bustle down by the river. Samuel clapped William on the shoulder. "Come, Andrew will be at his supper. Let us drink a tankard and see whether two Ulster heads cannot outwit the wilderness." The world seemed to change the instant they crossed the threshold of the City Tavern. Rough pine gave way to beeswaxed oak that gleamed underfoot. The air was warm with the mingled scents of Virginia tobacco curling from long clay pipes, the dark sweetness of roasting beef, and the faint dear bite of Madeira poured from cut-glass decanters. Candlelight rippled along polished mahogany tables, casting halos on the powdered wigs of lawyers, colonial delegates and provincial delegates deep in talk. Where common inns normally offered rough-hewn benches, here gentlemen stood elbow to elbow at tall tables, their white wigs glimmering in lamplight like ghostly crowns. Samuel led the way through the crowded room, William close behind, their boots thudding softly on the waxed boards. At a corner near the window, where the muddy street below met the distant gleam of the Delaware, they found the man they sought. Andrew Ellicott sat amid the clutter of his trade, rolled maps, a brass compass, and a small astronomical quadrant, the instruments of a surveyor who lived half in the wilderness and half in calculation. Before him rested a half-finished plate of venison and a glass of Madeira. He was a sturdy man in his early 30s, fair of complexion, with a broad, intelligent face softened by full cheeks and a hint of double chin, more prosperity than vanity. Beneath his high forehead, keen grey eyes studied a leather-bound journal. His dark hair was tied neatly back, and his plain but well-cut blue coat, with brass buttons gleaming, marked him as both practical and respectable. Samuel approached with a warm smile, removing his hat. "Mr. Ellicott, Andrew, if I may. Samuel MacAllister. We met at the old Buttonwillow Church. Allow me to present my kinsman, William Moffett, lately arrived and bound westward with me." Andrew looked up. The focus in his face softened into cordial recognition. He rose, extending a firm, calloused hand, steady, like the instruments he wielded. "Samuel, a pleasure at last, and William, well met. Please sit." His voice carried the calm, deliberate cadence of a Quaker-raised Pennsylvanian, tempered by years among rougher men. As they settled, Andrew gestured toward the maps spread before him. "I'm under commission from the Commonwealth to survey improvements to the old Forbes Road, widening traces, marking passes through the Alleghenies, perhaps new wagon cuts toward the Ohio country. Vital work if we're to open those lands properly." He paused, his expression dimming with a trace of homesick fondness. "I had hoped my wife might accompany me here, but Patience, Miss Biddle, my intended as she was, remained in Maryland with the children. Come April, we'll begin our survey westward. Between the proceeds of our Maryland estate and this commission, we intend to settle in Kentucky ourselves." Leaning forward, his eyes brightened with purpose. "I could use able help along the route. Lend me a hand with the surveys, and in return, I'll see you safely through to the Ohio with the advantage of my maps and connections. It will delay us but a single day on the Forbes. I've men waiting at Redstone, where our lines will end." He placed a finger on a yellowed map drawn a decade earlier. "Here," he said, tracing a rough path, "we follow Bird's Road, what they now call the National Road, to Redstone. From there, we take the Monongahela down to its meeting with the Allegheny at Pittsburgh, and then the Ohio itself. 392 miles on to Limestone, good harbor, and a straight way to the Buffalo Trace. That path leads straight into the bluegrass lands of Lexington. The place grows fast. We dare not wait too many more years." The three bent low over the maps, their heads nearly touching. The fire crackled, isinglass glowed red in the hearth, and their talk drifted to rivers, rifles, and the price of a future reckoned in silver, sweat, and the long brown waters of the Ohio. At last, Andrew raised his voice over the din of the room. "Aye," he said, smiling into his glass, "a man may have many a commodity here to better advantage. For every tool and every article bought in Harrisburg has borne the charge of its passage from this place, and a man must pay dear for every mile it's carried." Their talk was interrupted by a stranger, a sharp-faced man named Joseph, with his friend George at his elbow. Joseph listened for a moment, then cut into the conversation as if he owned it. "Your plan for hands?" he asked William, his eyes narrowing. "Indentured men? Or are ye bringing slaves?" William was struck dumb. The question had never once crossed the sea with him. George leaned in, his breath smelling of strong ale. "Man, ye canna bring in a crop, raise a barn, or saw your own lumber with just the sweat of your own brow. There's none out there looking to hire on. A man needs his labor settled." The words landed on William like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He, who had fled Ulster a tenant farmer with naught but the sweat of his own back and the hope in his heart, now felt the grim weight of a choice he never knew he'd have to make. The genteel chatter of the tavern, the clink of tankards, the sweet waft of pipe smoke, it all faded into a dull roar, replaced by a cold, grim silence that spoke of a future far more twisted and bitter than he had ever dreamed. Miller had warned him, "Patch what you can before you go west." In the hush that followed Joseph's question, William understood that the hardest thing to mend would not be a wagon or a horse, but the kind of man he chose to be when he reached Kentucky. The Philadelphia bell tolled for freedom, the blood of liberty versus the coal iron of chains. Iron, ink, and blood. The next morning, the practical work of preparing for the trip to Harrisburg was a blessed distraction. Rebecca's parents, William Robinson and Margaret, waited for them there. It was in their home, surrounded by her mother's Trimble kin and their connections to William Moffett's family. This very February, he and Rebecca would be wed in her parents' home. Having just arrived from Belfast and seeing his own parents for the last time. That memory was a small, warm ember in his chest. Rebecca had told her uncle she could bring him flaxseed and would carry back linens for the market stalls. That was the intended purpose of the trip, but for William the journey was something else entirely. One last tear-stained parting from his mother and father before the wilderness swallowed him whole. That final glimpse of their weary faces was the price he paid for this chance. The chance to finally own land and carve a life that was truly theirs, answerable to no landlord's whip. The sour taste of indecision was still in William's mouth as he turned from the river. His mind, heavy with the future, turned to the immediate, their wagon, a sorry thing waiting at the smithy. It needed just enough repair to carry their hopes to Harrisburg, where they would sell it and barter for a proper broad-ribbed Conestoga, beast built for the brutal journey west. The list of essential tools in his pocket felt like an anchor, each item now a moral question. Would it be wielded by a free man's hand or another's? He wound his way down Market Street, the city assailing his senses. Behind the London Coffee House, a line of men crowded the privies, the stench of piss and shite choking the air, a cloud of black flies hovering in a persistent, droning swarm. From blocks away, the dull, anxious throb of military drums and fifes echoed. He overheard two men. A low murmur passed between them, each syllable barbed and brittle. "They say the delegates mean to throw out the Articles. Could be the end of us. Our blood spilled for nay." The London Coffee House greeted him with its own thunder, a low, relentless roar of auctioneers and bidders. In the smoky half-light he saw the wares on offer, casks of sugar, puncheons of rum, and, standing among them as calmly as merchandise, stood shoulder to shoulder with human beings, enslaved Africans in irons and white servants bound by paper and despair, each awaiting the fall of the hammer. He quickened his pace, the bile rising in his throat, not wanting to talk or linger in that marketplace of souls. Suddenly, the church bells began to clang. But this was no holy summons, certainly not the bell of liberty. Its ring persistent, starting just as it had stopped raining, splitting the humid afternoon. He followed the sound, his boots sinking into streets churned to a thick mud of soil and horse shit, past workers heaving hogshead of malting rye and rum into a distillery, the sweet, grainy scent, a stark contrast to the surrounding filth. The church loomed, its weathered walls streaked with the city's grime. He stepped inside and was enveloped in a broth of pipe smoke, unwashed wool, and the sweat of anxious men. The pews were packed, a merchant shimmering in fine silk pressed against a farmer in a frayed homespun coat, all faces slick in the stifling warmth and humidity. A Quaker in a wide-awake hat worked his jaw, spitting a brown stream of tobacco onto the rough-hewn floorboards. At the front, a man with a preacher's collar pounded a gavel on a whiskey barrel. "Order!" he roared, his voice straining over the arguing crowd. "We'll have order, or by God we'll have a duel out front to settle it." In that charged, sweltering room, William understood. This was the new nation, not the shining republic of freedom he had once imagined, but a rough, shouting struggle for its very soul, each man haggling his own price for freedom or servitude. He and Rebecca had wagered all they possessed on its most perilous frontier. Two strangers pressed through the haze now, touching hat brims in a brisk salute, while their eyes weighed and sizing up William, introducing himself, Ephraim, reeking of turnip liquor, and a gaunt Virginian whose boots were crusted hard with red clay. Kentucky-bound? Ephraim growled, gaze lingering on the horn-hard calluses of William's hands. "Aye," William answered, the single word flat and final. "Land?" The Virginian gave a short, scoffing bark. "Land's a barren promise without arms to break it. Don't take it from me. Ask your fine Mr. Jefferson. Ask General Washington. Their acres didn't sprout from seed alone. They were bought and paid for in black flesh." He leaned closer, voice sinking to a gravelly murmur thick with contempt. "Word is Jefferson keeps nigh, on 600 souls at Monticello. Some whisper he's planted more than tobacco amongst 'em. His own blood runs in certain quarters of the slave cabins. Fine talk, that, from the man who pens, all men are created equal." He let the phrase hang a moment, then loosed a low, guttural laugh that rumbled up from the depths of his chest like distant thunder. The preacher thumped the barrel again. Article 4, "No person held to service or labor in one state shall be discharged by another." A storm of cheers and jeers erupted. A merchant stood, jabbing a finger. "Property is sacred. Even Madison says so." Ephraim leaned close, his breath a foul gust. "You'll need slaves, friend. Ain't no shame in it. Wolves don't weep for the deer." Outside, a wagon rattled past, its whole chains clanking with a sound that made William's throat tighten. He thought of his father's tenant plot in Ulster, the English landlord's boot on their necks, the eviction notice nailed to the door. Freedom, they'd called it here. Was this the freedom they meant? The freedom to become the very thing you hated? The Virginian spat a stream of chewed tobacco onto the wood planks, directly in front of where William was standing, then blurted at William, "Indentures die of fever. Indians bolt for the woods. Slaves stay. It's simple arithmetic, William." The gavel cracked. The speaker cleared his throat and continued, voice steady but edged with unease. The next clause reads, "Direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, by adding to the whole number of free persons, 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 compromise." Suddenly a rough voice erupted from the shadowed back of the room. "Call it what it is, they're counting a whole man as 3/5 of a person." A wave of bitter laughter rolled through the crowd, sharp and knowing, like the crack of a whip muffled in the rain. William felt sweat slick his palms, his shirt clinging to his back in the close tobacco-thick air. All across Philadelphia, the failing Articles of Confederation and the shadowy new Constitution dominated every tavern, coffee-house, and street-corner debate. The city pulsed with argument, hope, and dread. Through the window, streaked with years of grime and harbor soot, William caught sight of the docks below. A weathered dockhand heaved a crate, stamped Charleston onto the wharf. For an instant, something inside shifted, heavy, alive, a muffled thump, followed by a low, choked sound that might have been a whimper. It vanished instantly beneath the ceaseless din of ropes, shouts, and creaking timber. Ephraim's hand clamped onto William's arm, fingers digging in like forged iron. His voice dropped to a grim whisper. Miller's Wharf. Every Monday, they marched them straight off the ships, fresh cargo, strong backs, sold cheap to the highest bidder. The words hung between them, cold and final, while outside the river kept moving, indifferent, carrying its invisible weight toward whatever future the convention would forge. William shoved through the crowd, the bells tolling again as he stumbled back into the blinding sunlight. The stink of the docks clawed at him, salt, fish guts, and beneath it something darker, coppery, like old blood. A ship's captain bellowed, hawking his wares. Prime stock from Barbados, warranted sound and healthy. His soul was in turmoil. The bell in Philadelphia, it rang for freedom, aye, but the shackles of indentured servitude was awash in blood. That fierce hunger to claim our own land has blinded us to the sins of the past we so loudly condemn. He walked until his boots hit the riverbank. The water was brown, sluggish, carrying the weight of 1,000 contradictions eastward, back toward the ocean he'd crossed. Somewhere downstream, the Hibernian waited, its hold empty now. Freedom! He'd crossed an ocean to own his future. Now that future reeked of other men's sweat and the cold iron of chains. He was willing to make any sacrifice for the chance to own his own land and be slave to no man. "6 days to Harrisburg. While Rebecca bartered for their provisions, flour, hardtack, bacon packed in bran, coffee, and precious salt, William made his way to the wagon yard. It sprawled behind a low, broad-shouldered timber building whose sign, Miller and Sons, wheelwrights and smiths, hanging and broken, the pole leaning. The yard was chaos of life and industry. Horses stamped and whinnied, their noses puffing dust as they ate from troughs filled with oats and grains. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a blacksmith's hammer on an iron tire sent sparks flying like angry fireflies into the churned dirt. A handful of wagons, some proud Conestogas with their graceful boats curved like swans, others simple patched-up farm rigs, stood at odd angles. Piles of spare wheels, barrels of linseed oil, and coils of chain littered the ground. Teamsters and farmers, their faces as rough-hewn as the timber they stood on, haggled loudly. It was here, amidst the smell of iron, manure, and honest sweat, that the dream of the West felt most real and most fragile. There was a different Smith at the forge today, a younger man with a soot-streaked apron. William, his mind made up and his purse feeling light as a feather, pointed a finger toward the sturdy bay he'd eyed before. Knowing the last man had asked $12, he met the new Smith's eye, his own gaze hard as flint. "The old fellow wanted 12, William said, his voice low but carrying over the rattling din. "I've $8 silver in my hand here, and nae more. I'll take that bay off your hands and be on my way." The smith eyed him, then the glint of the coin, his eyes squinting for a moment before he gave a single curt nod. Aye, done. The deal was sealed. With one horse secured, the dream began to take on flesh and bone. With the wagon's wheels patched and new timbers scare in the frame where the old rotten ones had been, the real work began. William and Rebecca loaded their wee world into the bed. Crates of linen for Harrisburg, the flour barrels, the tools, the rolled-up bedding. The scent of dried apples and smoked bacon filled the space beneath the canvas. William hitched the team, put in the new bay in lead, and gave the harness a final tugging check. He came to Rebecca's side, his hand finding the small of her back. "If the road stays dry, Mo Creedy, and we dinna have to fight the mud, we might see a Da's house in 6 days. 7. If the Lord wishes to try us." He squinted down the western road, a dusty ribbon unfurling into the trees. "We should make Downingtown in 2. If an axle goes, Lancaster is about 4 days along the trail, but once we're across the Swatara at Pine Ford." He trailed off, a rare, weary smile touching his lips. "Aye, then we'll be home free." He did a final check on the rigging, his hands sure on the knots, feeling the strength of the horses. With a click of his tongue and a gentle shake of the reins, the wagon creaked forward. The wheels began to turn, carrying them away from the stink of the wharf and the weight of its impossible choices, and toward the dark, bloody, and waiting ground. And maybe, God willing, toward the hope of a wee new bairn in a home of their own. Each jolt of the wagon carried them farther from the wharf, from the iron clank of chains, the ink-smeared clauses, and the hot, crowded air that priced men like hogsheads. The choices waiting on the far side of the Appalachians would be no easier, but for this 1 mile, with Rebecca at his side and the road running west, William swore that land might yet be won by iron, ink, and blood that were only his. Threads of departure. 4 days out of Harrisburg, the wagon pitched hard to the left, wheels biting into the rutted, rain-slicked trail. William cursed under his breath, hauling on the reins. The old bay snorted and scrambled for footing, the harness creaking like a ship in a gale. A sharp crack split the air. The left rear wheel shuddered, iron rim clanging loose. God above, William muttered. He yanked the team to a halt, mud spraying from the wheels. Jumping down, he knelt in the muck. The patched spoke was splitting, the iron band that Miller's boys had hammered on barely clinging. Another mile, 2 at most, and the whole rig would crumple like a wet leaf. The wind howled down from the ridges like a warning, sharp and merciless, slicing through the bare branches overhead and carrying the bite of coming frost. The wagon sat crooked in the rutted trail, one rear wheel with shattered spokes, splintered like broken bones, iron rim twisted. Behind William, Rebecca drew her woolen shawl tighter across her chest, the fabric already heavy with damp and cold. Her eyes, wide and dark in the fading light, never left his back as he crouched beside the wreckage. No choice. No roadside smithy. No spare wheel waiting like a miracle. They were miles from the next settlement, the sky bruising toward dusk, and the only tools they had were the ones lashed beneath the seat. William exhaled, breath clouding white. "Sometimes, Rebecca," he said, voice low and rough, "I think God has forsaken me." The words hung between them, heavier than the wind. She stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft earth, and wrapped her arms around him from behind. Her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the tremor in his shoulders, the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. "He has not forsaken you," she whispered fiercely, her voice steady even as her own heart hammered. "He made you stubborn for a reason. So you would find your own way when the road broke beneath you." William closed his eyes for a heartbeat, letting her warmth seep through the chill. Then he straightened, jaw set. He reached under the wagon seat and dragged out the battered tools, unrolled the rawhide to reveal its meager contents. A worn claw hammer, a coil of stiff rawhide, a few ash and oak staves salvaged from an earlier repair, a scattering of iron nails blackened with age. Not much, barely enough. But enough, maybe, if his hands remembered what his mind refused to forget. The wind rose again, whistling through the trees like distant bagpipes mourning a lost cause. The temperature dropped by the minute. Rebecca could feel it in her fingertips, in the way the cold crept under her skirts and settled against her skin. "Hand me the rawhide," William said. His voice was quiet now, but steady, calm in the way only a man who had already decided to fight could be. Rebecca knelt beside him without hesitation. The ground was cold and wet through her skirt, small pebbles pressed into her knees like accusations. Her fingers, already stiff and aching, closed around the heavy coil. She passed it to him, their hands brushing for a moment, his rough and warm from work, hers chilled. He warmed her hands for a moment, then took the rawhide, met her eyes for one long second. No more words were needed. The wheel would be mended, or they would walk. Either way, they would go forward. Together. As the first stars pricked the darkening sky and the wind carried the faint, far-off cry of a night bird, William began to work, hammer striking nail, rawhide binding splintered wood, stubborn resolve against the gathering dark. Rebecca stayed close, feeding him staves and nails, her breath fogging the air between them, 2 souls refusing to be broken on a lonely frontier road. William wrapped it tight around wood splints securing the broken spoke, driving nails through it with quick, brutal blows. Crude work, but it might hold, if the trail didn't get worse. He rose, wiping mud from his knees and palms. His hands were trembling now, though whether from cold or the weight of what lay ahead, he couldn't say. He met Rebecca's eyes. "We'll move slow. Spare the wheel. Pray we reach Lancaster before she gives out." She nodded once, chin high, as if daring the mountains themselves to stand in their way. "We should make Lancaster by morn." William clambered back into the wagon seat. He clucked to the bay, and they rumbled forward again, westward, always westward, each mile now a wager against luck and time. The wheels, just a little warped, bumped along the rutted track with a drum-like rhythm, a steady percussive beat that settled deep in Rebecca's bones. Her mind drifted on a slow, deep current, fighting to stay awake, counting the miles they had already endured and the many more that still lay ahead, exhausted and drifting into a trance-like slumber. The 6-day journey to Harrisburg stretched before them, a ribbon of dust and longing unspooling toward the cradle of her birth. But Rebecca knew, in the quietest chamber of her soul, that the greater journey was not the one beneath the wagon wheels. It was the one within, an inward passage through the dreaming currents of memory. The steady clatter of the wheels became her metronome, their rhythm pulling old recollections to the surface, each turn of the axle unwinding another thread of her life. Harrisburg had anchored her childhood, yet it was the great Atlantic crossing to her mother's kin in Belfast that truly steered her fate. There she had been woven into the fabric of the Trimble family, a clan bound for generations to the Moffetts, clan ties and friendship as tight and enduring as a ship's rope. That enduring bond had drawn her years earlier to the Philadelphia docks, where she would first lay eyes on him. He emerged from the ship not with bluster, but with a quiet gravity that parted the chaos around him. William Moffett was tall and lean, just 21, the Ulster's rough schooling evident in his hands and bearing. His hair was dark, his shoulders broad, but it was his eyes that held her fast, clear blue, steady as granite. His body still swayed beneath him. He had sailed with his brothers, David and Thomas, the three bound for freedom and promised to own land. William promised to apprenticeship and opportunity with William Robinson. Walking down the gangplank, it was William who met her gaze and did not look away. When he spoke, his Scots brogue was thick and rich as fresh-churned butter, a sound both foreign and familiar to her ear. On the road to Harrisburg, where he would apprentice in her father's cooperage, some unspoken current began to move between them. It was no tempest, but something slower, truer, the steady rooting of affection in good soil. The Robinsons took William in, and he worked and boarded under their roof. In the long evenings after the day's labour, fondness blossomed in the quiet hours, the fire in the hearth now smouldering embers beneath the ash. He would sit beside her while she spun flax into linen, her hands quick and sure, her thimble glinting in the lamplight. He watched her stitch as though tracing a map for the life they were beginning to imagine together. Now that life had a date, February the 2nd, a Friday. The plans were made, the wedding in Harrisburg, then a new wagon for the long journey come late April. They would join Samuel, Martha Jane, and Andrew's family on the perilous road south and west, over the Forbes and Birds Road and into the shadowed unknown of Redstone. Her mind swirled with the clamour of tasks, wedding linens to finish, provisions to pack, lists to amend. Yet beneath the bustle lay a quieter ache. She thought of William's farewell on the Ulster docks, his mother's streaming tears, his father's firm embrace and final handshake. They had known, as emigrants always did, that it was the last touch, the final glimpse. That memory haunted her now as she watched him guiding their wagon across the uneven ruts, his profile strong in the pale moonlight. Would she, too, bid such a farewell? How long until she saw her own parents again, if ever? The road ahead promised a new life together and a new world, but it demanded the old one as its price. The wagon jolted over a rock, jarring her from her reverie. She lifted her eyes to the horizon, gleaming faintly in the west. West, she thought, always west. The word trembled like a vow in her chest. The road goes west, as the warped wheel drummed its unsteady rhythm westward. Rebecca saw it all again. William's sea-steady gaze on the docks, the ember of their beginning. The road goes west, broken spokes and all. Windows like promises. Harrisburg, home. The old bay horse, its coat lathered and dark with sweat, knew the scent of home on the wind. As the evening began to bleed into dusk, the animal's pace quickened with a sudden, knowing energy, making the worn wagon rattle and groan over the cobblestone ruts of the street. The sound was familiar music now, the creak of seasoned wood, the jingle of harness chains, the solid crunch of iron-rimmed wheels biting into the earth. They turned past Second and Market, the brick courthouse, a stern, dark silhouette against the fading sky. Directly across from the courthouse was the sign of the Bear Tavern. They rolled slowly past Golden Light and the faint roar of crowded voices spilled from its windows, a world of transience they were now leaving behind. And then, there it was, the Robinson home, its windows glowing like a promise in the gathering dark. Harrisburg, the first morning of October, 1786. The Robinson house woke slowly, the way old houses do when they know their people are home again. From the kitchen drifted the familiar sounds, iron striking stone, a kettle lid clattering, low voices murmuring, and then a bright burst of laughter that could only mean Phoebe had just teased Hannah about something. The smells followed close behind, ham sizzling in its own fat, cornbread turning golden in the Dutch oven, and the sharp sweetness of cider still working in the barrel. Rebecca stepped through the keeping-room door and stopped short. Phoebe, 42, broad as a doorway, apron white as Sunday, turned from the hearth, spoon in hand and tears already tracing her cheeks. "Law, child," she cried, "your skin and bones!" Before Rebecca could answer, she was folded into arms that had rocked her through every childhood fever and nightmare. Phoebe smelled of wood smoke, cinnamon, and home. Behind her, Hannah lingered a heartbeat, 17 now, tall and coltish, her dark skin glowing in the firelight, then threw herself forward. "Miss Rebecca, you're really here?" Rebecca hugged her tight, feeling the girl's ribs beneath the linsey-woolsey dress, the quick flutter of her heart. "I missed you both more than Belfast linen," she whispered. William stood quietly in the doorway, coat still on, letting the women have their moment. Over Rebecca's shoulder, Phoebe caught sight of him, her face softening. "Master Will," she said, using the old familiar title without thinking. "Glad you bring her back safe." He gave a small nod that meant more than words. A few minutes later, they were all gathered in the dining room. Sunlight poured through the small glass panes, catching on the pewter until it gleamed like newly minted silver. Rebecca sat beside her mother, William beside her. Margaret Robinson presided at the head of the table, straight-backed and composed, her light red hair, now streaked with silver, caught in a neat knot that shimmered like frost on rowan berries. Her green eyes, sharp as winter glass, sought every face before her, softening only when they found Rebecca next to William. Across from her sat William Robinson, beard trimmed for the occasion, his large hands resting on the table as though claiming again the place he'd long waited to fill. Bowls and platters came in, steaming oats, thick curls of ham crisp at the edges, cornbread so hot the butter ran in bright yellow rivers. Phoebe and Hannah moved between kitchen and dining room, quiet and sure, though their smiles kept breaking through. When all were served, William Robinson leaned back and fixed young William with a cooper's measuring eye. "So, Will," he said, his voice warm with smoke and cider. "Rebecca tells me you have turned a Philadelphia distiller into a steady customer for hogsheads." Rebecca's knee brushed William's under the table, half warning, half pride. "Aye, sir," he said. "Abraham Overholt took 24 barrels before we had our wagon headed west, and begs 20% more come spring. Pays in silver, not Congress paper." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle. "Rebecca calls it the Bourbon line." Margaret's brow lifted, and her husband's eyes glinted. William Robinson gave a low, pleased whistle. 24 already? And you not even properly wed?" He leaned forward, the old craftsman's hunger alive in his gaze. "Still remember the numbers, lad." William set his spoon down with quiet precision. 32 white oak staves, 48 inches long, inch and a quarter thick, inside hollow 3½ degrees, outside bevel near 2. Taper 1 and 3/4 aside. 6 riveted iron hoops. Crows undercut a hare so the headlock's sweet. Drive the bilge hoops tight. You'll not see daylight between staves. Lay the whisky in her, and she'll not lose a thimbleful twixt here and Belfast. The room went still for a heartbeat before William Robinson's laugh broke forth. Deep, satisfied, the sound of a man hearing a favourite tune played true. Margaret's eyes shone. Phoebe, carrying the cider jug, paused in the doorway and nodded with quiet pride. Rebecca felt warmth flood her chest. Pride, relief, the fierce joy of belonging, of being home among those who had always believed in them. The October light shifted across the table, catching the rising steam like a promise. Outside, a wagon rumbled along the river road. The Susquehanna slid by, dull silver under the autumn sky. Inside, the fire crackled, the plates gleamed, and for one quiet morning, the world felt wide enough for every dream they carried. October already had a chill in the air. The yard behind the Robinson house lay with a thin layer of frost-covered muck that sucked at every boot heel. A raw wind knifed down off the ridge, carrying the smell of wet bark, decaying leaves, and the faint sour ghost of last week's apple pomace from the cider press. William stood beside the emptied wagon, coat thrown open despite the cold, shirt plastered to his back with honest sweat. He ran one scarred palm along a cracked sideboard oak gone grey and hungry for pitch, listening to the dull, hollow complaint of the wood. Hannah, quiet as always, had already carried the last crate indoors. Only the iron-bound trunk with Rebecca's linen samples remained. She unpacked the linen for Margaret. William tapped a loose spoke clack, clack, heard the faint ring of a cracked fallow. He was feeling the old familiar weight settle on his shoulders, barrels promised to Abraham Overholt in Philadelphia, a Conestoga yet to be bought, 600 miles of mountain and river ahead, the wedding with Rebecca coming nearer every dawn. He drew a slow breath of cold river air. The smell of decaying leaves and wood smoke filled the air. The river seemed to be rising. It was higher than when they arrived. That evening the sign of the Susquehanna glowed like a ship in the dark. Inside, the hearth roared, sparks drifting upward, the smell of hickory and trimmed applewoods. The low ceiling trapped a blue haze of pipe smoke and the sharper bite of fermented cider. Men's voices rolled like wagon wheels over cobbles, some laughing, some arguing land prices and taxes in low, urgent tones. Rebecca's father led him straight to the best table where William Maclay waited. Maclay rose tall, straight as a survey pole, the firelight sliding across the snowy yellow velvet of his coat, standing collar with lace jabot, and the delicate froth of lace at his wrists. Maclay was a well-dressed man. Candle flame winked on a silver stock buckle, and on the careful club of brown hair already retreating from a high, thoughtful forehead. He looked exactly what he was, a man who had drawn the streets of Harrisburg on parchment, while others were still arguing about whose ox could graze where. He was one of the more prominent landowners and speculators. Rebecca's father made the introduction with pride. William inclined his head, polite, but his eyes blue and unblinking fixed on Maclay the way a cooper studies a suspicious stave for hidden rot. They sat. A pewter mug of dark porter was pressed into William's hand. It tasted of toasted sweet barley and the cold iron of the river itself. Maclay wasted no words. Kentucky is still Virginia, Mr. Moffett, and Virginia is still chaos. Meets and bounds begin at the sycamore, thence to the buffalo trace, thence to the hand of God. Half the claims overlap, the other half are eaten by lawyers. He traced a square on the scarred tabletop with the point of a knife. North of the Ohio, the new ordinance of '85 will lay the land in perfect townships 6 miles by 6, numbered clean. But Kentucky is grandfathered under the old madness. You will need a warrant from Richmond, a surveyor who fears God and fears you more, and a title clear of every soldier who ever carried a brown bess. William listened, thumbs hooked in his belt, feeling the heat of the fire on one cheek and the cold draught from the door on the other. Each time Maclay spoke of influence, or the governor's office, something inside William tightened like a hoop driven too hard. Maclay leaned closer, the lace at his cuff brushed the table's edge. When you reach Richmond, mention my name. Patrick Henry and I correspond. A word from Harrisburg may keep your warrant from gathering dust." William set his mug down slowly. The porter's foam left a dark moustache on his upper lip. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and met Macleigh's eyes full on steady, searching, cold as the river outside. "Mr. Macleigh," he said, the name spoken once, deliberate, the way he spoke a man's name when he meant to be remembered. "I've crossed an ocean to be done with titles bought by favour and land granted by patronage. I'll take your advice on surveyors and warrants, and I thank thee for it. But when I set my plough in Kentucky soil, it'll be on ground I can defend with my own two hands and a clear conscience, not on a gentleman's whisper in some governor's ear." A log cracked in the hearth. Sparks flew up like startled birds. Rebecca's father shifted, uneasy. Macleigh's smile thinned, but the eyes behind it were shrewd, measuring, not yet offended. "Then you'll need a sharper conscience than most, Mr. Moffett," he answered quietly, "and stronger hands. Kentucky forgives neither." William lifted his mug again, the pewter cool against his palm, and drank without breaking the gaze. Outside, the river kept moving, dark, wide, and rising, carrying tree limbs from the mountains, and the promise of high water come April. Inside, two men, one in lace, one in plain wool homespun, weighed each other across a table that smelled of porter and ambition, while the road west waited for whichever of them proved the more stubborn. From dusk to dawn, the windows glowed like promises. First a beacon in the dark for the weary traveller, then a hearthlight for dreams measured in oak staves and unbroken vows. The moon knows the ending. Harrisburg, October 7th, 1786. The hunter's moon knows the ending, because it does. It watched them make vows by firelight, watched the river take the pumpkins, watched the blood soak into the warrant paper. And it will watch whatever comes next. The moon hung over the river like a bruised pumpkin, low and swollen, the colour of fresh blood seen through thin milk. It poured a cold orange light across the frost-rimed fields and turned every bare tree into a black claw against the sky. Inside the Robinson house the windows glowed gold, defiant. The great hearth roared. Sparks, like tiny ephemeral fireflies, erupted from the heart of the blaze, catching the powerful draught, rising quickly into the dark, swallowed by chimney. Long shadows danced across the whitewashed stone. In the cosy comfort of the Robinson home, the air was thick with the smell of searing fat, wood smoke, and the dark sweetness of molasses bubbling in a pot of beans. A haunch of venison shot 2 days earlier by William's own rifle turned slowly on a spit, dripping into the flames with a soft hiss that sounded almost like rain. They sat close around the oak table, shoulders brushing, William Robinson at the head, beard shot with grey, Margaret, alert and poised, her green eyes catching every flicker of the fire, Rebecca, cheeks flushed from the heat, one hand resting unconsciously on William's thigh, and William Moffett beside her, still as a heron. In all truth, October would henceforth claim that title in dreadful earnest, as memory itself was to be inscribed in deluge and devastation. To Rebecca and William, the season appeared as naught but the dissolution of successive days, each weighted by the burden of unfinished plans and urgent necessity. The long Pennsylvania rifle leaning within reach against the hearthstones like a silent guest. Across from them were Archibald MacAllister and his intended Margaret Hayes. Archibald's scarlet regimental coat was off, draped on a chair back, but the soldier still sat in it, spine straight, cuffs spotless, the candlelight glinting off the brass buttons he had not yet bothered to change for civilian life. William Robinson carved the venison with steady strokes. The knife scraped bone. Fat hissed when it hit the platter. Merchant in town offered me Pennsylvania paper for the corn, his voice displaying concern. "Half its face value," said the war debt's eating the rest. Archibald gave a short, humourless laugh. "The articles are dead, sir. 13 purses, 13 mouths, and no one willing to pay the tavern bill. I've been drilling the militia again men who fought at Saratoga, now afraid to leave their barns unguarded." Rebecca's spoon stilled halfway to her lips. Outside, the great orange moon stared through the window like it already knew the ending. It was then that William Moffett leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I've heard the shouting in the ordinaries," he said, his Scots burr thickening with his intensity. "But I must ask you gentlemen plainly, as men who ken more of ledgers and legislatures than I do. What was the fuss about these articles we're throwing out? We fought a war to be shed of a king, and we got this confederation. Now we're to be shed of that too, for this new constitution with no Bill of Rights. I see the wagon is broken, but is the new one any sounder?" Archibald and William Robinson exchanged a look. It was explained to William that freedom was being bargained for, and freedom did not always mean freedom for all in this new land. The movement of separatists through revolution were successful in our independence from England's monarchy. But what was our government, and how would freedom be divvied up? William understood the monarchical structure well enough. The nobles inherit the House of Lords, controlling all the wealth. The Commons, though elected, were a corrupt farce, where seats were won in rotten boroughs controlled by aristocrats. The Articles of Confederation, they agreed, were no better. In 85, William Robinson said, fixing young William with a steady gaze, under the Articles of Confederation, the states handle near everything themselves. The vote? That belongs only to white men with property. 40 acres or more, mind you. Maybe 1 in 20 of us could cast a ballot. There is no true national government, no way to force the states to pay their fair share or pull together as one. Congress can pass an ordinance, aye, but it needs 9 states to agree, and even then, there is no one to enforce it if a state simply balks. Think of it, Will. It started as a committee of 13 men, put together by John Dickinson, chaired by a gentleman from Delaware. Landowners, most of them. Each state kept its full sovereignty. Our Congress can beg, but it cannot command. He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping. That's why the Confederation Congress has so little bargaining power. No direct taxation, no control over trade between the states, no executive to see laws carried out. It depends entirely on the state's goodwill for money, for soldiers, and for keeping treaties. To Spain, to France, to England, we look less like a nation and more like a loose alliance of quarrelsome sovereigns. And our own goods, taxed over and over as they crossed each state's border, as if we were foreign to one another. Archibald added his comments, his soldier's precision cutting through history. It was ratified in 81. And now, men like Madison and Hamilton say it is a rope of sand. They fear anarchy more than they fear a distant king. Look to Massachusetts, taking patriots to debtor jails for taxes, worthless paper to pay them, Shays and his men seizing courts. So they meet in Philadelphia, in secret, and draft a new constitution. One executive who can veto the whole Congress. A standing army to enforce federal law. They argue a Bill of Rights is redundant, that the structure itself secures liberty. Patrick Henry refuses to join delegates, arguing for a Bill of Rights. Margaret Robinson set her cup down hard enough to rattle the saucer, her voice cutting through the tension. They threw out the old articles like yesterday's dishwater. It has no Bill of Rights. They're writing a new frame in Philadelphia, secret as monks, one man to veto the whole Congress, and a standing army to make it stick. Rebecca felt a cold dread at his words. She had heard the other women whispering in the market, their voices tight with fear of anarchy. Daniel Shays and the Shayites seized the courts in Massachusetts, then attempted attack on the Springfield Armory. What next? Archibald then spoke firmly. Heard the Paxton men are riding again. Not Elder's old crew, but close enough. If this new government comes for our muskets or our purses, they'll meet cold steel on the Lancaster Road. Silence fell, broken only by the pop of burning hickory and the soft drip of fat. William Moffett had said nothing more through the meal, only watched and listened, steely blue eyes moving from face to face the way a cooper looks at wood grain of a stave. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, deliberate. Paper's a lie that learns ty walk. My father lost a farm, tay a landlord's ledger. I'll trust powder, lead, and the way to honest silver in my hand afore I trust any man at the Philadelphia State House." He reached for the salt, knuckles scared from the shaving horse, and the firelight slid across the hard line of his mouth. William Robinson looked around the table at his daughter, soon to be married and headed into this uncertain world, then at the soldier with the steady hand, at the quiet young Ulsterman who had already buried one life and was building another with nothing but calluses and stubborn will. "Aye," he said at last. "Until Mr. Madison and his friends give us amendments we can read by this same fire, we'll keep our own counsel, and our own muskets clean." Outside, the hunter's moon climbed higher, cold and merciless, washing the fields silver. Inside, the venison cooled on the platter, the beans gave off their last sweet steam, and 8 people sat in the small circle of light, listening to the wind worry the shutters, and feeling the future press against the door like an uninvited guest. The hunter's moon had risen higher, its bloody orange bled to merciless silver, turning the windows from glowing defiance to pale mirrors of the night. They had pledged faith in powder and silver over printed paper, but the moon's cold gaze knew the wilderness would demand a darker coin. October 9th, 1786. Blood on the paper, pulp on the water. It rose over Harrisburg like a fresh heart ripped out, and held high, swollen, dripping orange fire across the stubbled fields, turning every blade of frost into a red needle. The wind carried the taste of iron from the Susquehanna, and every dog in the county barked itself hoarse at the sky. Horses stood rigid in their paddocks, ears pinned flat, staring east as if the devil rode that moon in person. By the 15th, the town was a powder keg with a lit fuse. Outside the sign of the Black Bear, the night air rang with the clatter of hooves and the low, angry growl of men who had nothing left to lose. James Wilson, Philadelphia lawyer, black coat buttoned to the throat, voice smooth and cold as a court writ, stood in the muddy street flanked by 2 constables and a nervous deputy sheriff. In his gloved hand he held the paper that would strip Samuel Johnston of his farm and drag him east in irons for debt. Inside the tavern, Johnston and 20 neighbors barred the door with benches and barrel staves. Muskets poked through cracked shutters. The smell of fresh priming drifted out like a challenge. Johnston's roar rolled through the walls. "You'll take my land or my dead body, Wilson. Come closer with your rag money warrant, and we'll send ye back to Philadelphia in a box." A pistol cracked from the street sharp, flat, vicious. The ball splintered the door and buried itself in a farmer's thigh with a wet thud. Blood hissed onto the walls and floorboards. A woman screamed once, high and thin. Then the night exploded with hoofbeats. The Paxtang riders came down the Carlisle road like a storm of iron and fury. 30 men in hunting wearing old regimental coats, faces blackened with soot and rage. Muskets reversed. They swung the butts like clubs. The constables went down beneath a rain of blows. James Wilson's fine black coat was torn from his back. The warrant fluttered into the mud and was trampled under shod hooves. Someone fired a musket into the air. The report rolled across the river like thunder. The crowd roared, the town bleeding in the failure of the Articles. Wilson and his men were driven back toward the ferry landing. Hats lost, faces bleeding, the taste of their own fear sharp on their tongues. The farmers poured out of the Black Bear, Johnston at their head, eyes wild in the orange light. It was Shays' rebellion reborn on the west bank of the Susquehanna. No soldiers this time. Only Philadelphia lawyers and their scraps of worthless paper. But the town had already swallowed worse. 3 nights earlier, Mary McGuinness had been found in her cabin by Paxton Creek, skull shattered, blood thick and black on the puncheon floor, the air inside still sweet with death and cold ashes. The widow's sow squealed in the empty pen, 1 pig gone, butchered in the dark. Sheriff Kelker's posse had run the killer to ground in a Carlisle hay barn. When the door burst open, one of Kelly's mates charged with an axe raised high. A militia musket answered at arm's length. The ball took the man's face clean off and painted the barn wall in a steaming red fan. They dragged John Kelly back, trussed across a saddle, wrists raw, the new jail's pine planks waiting to drink his shadow. That night, families hammered closed their door bolts, and listened to the river rise, to the wind rattle the shutters like dice in a dead man's hand. Under the butcher's moon, the new republic did not feel like liberty any longer. It felt like a rope tightening, one slow turn at a time. When the sun finally broke, it revealed not a republic of parchment and lofty words, but one of mud and consequences. The rope was not around their necks, but in their hands, a tool for pulling debtors to jail, for dragging killers to gallows, for binding communities together with fear as much as hope. Liberty had not fled. It had simply come down from the philosophical heavens to walk the earth, and its boots were caked with the same blood and orange pulp that stained every doorstep in Harrisburg. The pumpkin flood, nature's own gavel. Then the sky itself cracked open. For 3 days and nights the rain came sideways, hard as thrown gravel, drumming on shake roofs, until the sound became a single endless roar. The river answered with a growl that grew into a bellow. By the morning of the 17th, the Susquehanna had climbed its banks like a living thing, thick and brown and furious, carrying the smell of turned earth and broken cornstalks. From the high ground behind the Robinson house, William watched it come. First came the thousands of pumpkins, torn from the bottomland fields, rolling and tumbling in the current like the severed heads of giants, their orange rinds gleaming wet under the sickly moon. They knocked together with hollow, wet thuds, a grotesque armada bobbing past uprooted hencoops, split-rail fences, the carcass of a drowned cow turning slow circles, belly swollen and pale. The water took the lower ferry landing first. The big horseboat ripped from its cable with a sound like a musket volley and spun away downstream, oars still locked in the rowlocks, riding high and empty. Then the warehouses along Water Street groaned, shuddered, and folded into the flood with a noise like bones breaking. Barrels of flour burst open. The river turned the color of café au lait and stank of wet wheat. A child's cradle floated past upside down, rocking gently, as though the baby were still asleep inside. All night the town listened to the river eat. At dawn the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The moon, still that same butcher's orange, hung low and bloated over a world remade in mud. The streets were ankle-deep in orange pulp and river silt. Shattered pumpkins lay split open like pale suns, their seed scattered across the planks like shot. The air reeked of bruised vegetation and drowned livestock, sweet and sickening at once. Yet when the water fell back, sullen and ashamed, the town counted its dead and found fewer than feared. The ice flood of '84 had taken roofs, livestock, whole families. This one had taken sheds, corn cribs, the lower floors of a dozen houses, nothing that could not be rebuilt by men with strong backs and stronger wills. William stood on the ridge at sunrise, coat soaked through, boots crusted with yellow clay, and watched the river slide past, slow now, almost apologetic. Beside him, Rebecca rested one hand on the small of her back. The other arm around William together stared at the orange wreckage drifting south. God's own judgment, someone muttered behind them. William only shook his head, feeling the cold air now filled with rot. No, he said quietly. Just a warning. The real reckoning would come later, and not by way of the river. Below them, the 3/4 pumpkin moon finally sank, bleeding out along the hills, while the Susquehanna shouldered its burden of ruined harvests toward the sea and left Harrisburg standing knee-deep in mud, and questions no man dared give voice. The gavel had fallen. The trial of hope against wilderness, of paper promises against the weight of water, was adjourned. The verdict was written not in ink, but in a slurry of silt and orange pulp plastered across the face of the town. The sentence was not death, but a choice, to see the muck as a grave, or as the first fertile layer of a new world. As the last of the pumpkin moon bled away, it left them standing in the docket of their own future, the evidence of all that was fragile swirling at their feet, waiting for their plea. Three vows for the wilderness. Late December 1786. The wind outside cut like a living blade, stripping the last ragged leaves from the oaks and flinging them against the windows like brittle knuckles begging entry. Inside the Robinson keeping room, the hearth roared. hickory logs crackling, spitting sparks that died against soot-blackened chimney. The air was thick with home's familiar scent, the sweet smell, like fresh-cut hay from new-spun flax, mingled with the deep, resinous breath of burning oak. Rebecca's wheel hummed whir, 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 the steady music of work that needed no companion. For a long while it was the only sound. William stood just behind her, his coat unbuttoned, hands resting light on her shoulders. His thumbs traced slow circles at the nape of her neck, warming her skin. This hour was stolen. Her parents had gone to market with Phoebe and Hannah to the mill. Privacy came dear in the Robinson house, rarer than silver coin, and they treasured it in silence. The heat of the fire mingled with their closeness, her back pressed against his chest, his breath stirring the loose strands at her temple. No words yet, only the rhythm of wheel and heart, the quiet promise in the weight of his touch. At last Rebecca rose. The wheel slowed, then stopped. She turned into the narrow space between them, her body brushing his, and pressed something small and cold into his palm. William looked down, surprise breaking across his face in a low laugh warm as hearth light. "So, Rebecca, a trimble thimble, and what are ye mending today?" Her green eyes held his, steady as a surveyor's plumb line. "Our future," she said simply. She folded his fingers over the engraved steel ring. "I brought 5 from Belfast," she murmured, her voice low, the Scots lilt soft on her words. "1 for each year we mean to be richer than we are now. This one is yours, William Moffett. Carry it in your pocket every day, until the land beneath us is paid for twice over, and the roof above our heads answers to no man but us. When that day comes, you'll lay it on our table and give it back to me, not before." He turned the thimble in his hand. It felt heavier than steel had any right to be. The trimble mark caught the firelight like a spark of purpose. "And how do we fill the years between?" he asked. Rebecca crossed to the shelf and drew down her ledger, its leather soft and worn like an old bridle. She opened it on the table between them. Candlelight wavered, shadows darting across columns of bold, precise figures. "Abraham Overholt has taken 44 hogsheads already," she began, tapping a line with her finger. "He begs 40 more come April. We charge 20% for freight, yet pay only 5 to Harris. That's £100 clear profit in silver before the river even rises. Another run in late spring, and we'll have nearly 200, plus the 220 still owing from linen and flax. Trust my numbers, William. By next spring we'll have coin for a prime Conestoga, hired hands at Redstone, and cash enough for a surveyor who takes silver, not promises." She looked up, her eyes bright. "Every barrel that rolls west toward Pittsburgh and Overholt's rye pulls Kentucky a little closer. Write that in the margin, then. Ledger entry, the Bourbon line." William's hand tightened around the thimble. He'd meant to speak of his brothers, David and young Thomas, gone these 2 years to find cousin Robert Moffett in Boonesborough. But his throat closed around the thought. The ache of their absence pressed against his chest. Rebecca saw it all the same, almost as though she could hear his thoughts. "Your brothers crossed an ocean and half a wilderness on hope and a prayer," she said softly. "We will not. We'll cross on earned silver and a plan no man can tax away." Her hand came down on the ledger, firm and sure. 3 vows, William. First, no debt west of the mountains. Second, every shilling rolls downhill toward the land like a well-hooped barrel. Nothing wasted on show. Nothing risked on Congress paper. Third, when we stand on our own porch and the deed is clean, you'll set that thimble on our table and we'll know the road is paid. The wind screamed around the eaves like a warning, then dropped to a steady moan. Inside, the fire settled into glowing coals. William slipped the thimble into the pocket over his heart, pressing it against his skin where it would stay, through flood, fever, and 40 years' worth of storms. "Aye, Rebecca," he said at last, his voice rough with wonder and iron certainty. "I'll carry it over every ridge and across every river. And when I lay it down again, it'll be on our own table, in our own house, with our bairns running beneath it." Outside, the winter storm raged on. Inside, two people bent their heads over a fire and a ledger, and began, one careful barrel, one hard-won shilling, one engraved thimble at a time, to build a home, a life, a small kingdom carved from the wilderness. A thimble to guard the hand, a vow to guard the heart, and the world began to build itself around them, a nation to tame a continent. January 1787. New Year, New Republic. January settled softly over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, draping the land in a hush of white. From the dining-room window, the Robinsons and William Moffett looked out upon fields remade into a quilt of silver and pearl, the bare oak limbs glistening with frost. Inside, the air shimmered with warmth and light, the great hearth roaring, shadows dancing over whitewashed walls. Hickory smoke mingled with the scent of roasting venison and the faint, clean edge of winter clinging to their coats. The talk around the heavy oak table, still cluttered with the remains of supper, had drifted from the coming wedding to the uneasier subject of the country's soul. "It's not the cold outside that chills me," said William Robinson, pushing a folded copy of the Independent Gazetteer across the table. "Eleazar Oswald writes plain sense, I think. He calls this new constitution a tyrant's charter. Patrick Henry himself raises the cry, and he's the very man who must sign land deeds in Kentucky." Margaret Robinson, mending a blanket by the fire, gave a sharp sigh. "And if they refuse to ratify it? What then? Shall we creep back to the chaos of the Articles? Courts seized in Massachusetts, paper money printed on Monday, and worthless by Tuesday. Have we forgotten so soon?" William Moffett, his hands rough and scarred from the cooper's shed, leaned forward. "The man in the tavern cares little for constitutions," he said in his low Scots burr. "He wants coin that will buy flour, and a deed that will hold when the governor changes. Talk of a Bill of Rights means little if he's no land to stand on while speaking them." Rebecca looked up from where she sat beside her mother, her face calm, eyes bright with thought. "That's the heart of it, William. It's commerce and coin, not just principle. Under the Articles, a single barrel of flour sent to Baltimore can be taxed 3 times by 3 different states. How can a man build on such shifting ground? If this new constitution can bring order to trade, and make a Virginia deed lawful in Pennsylvania, then it's a risk worth weighing." Her father tapped the newspaper again. "But Patrick Henry, Lee, Mason, they fear a government in Philadelphia will be as distant and grasping as the one we cast off. They demand their Bill of Rights as a shield." Rebecca did not flinch. "Perhaps they're right to want one," she said, "but a shield is little help when the house itself is burning. The Shiites did not rise because authority was too strong, but because it was too weak, too frail to spare them ruin. Kentucky will have its part in all this, whether as Virginia's frontier or as a state of its own. But if we mean to tame a continent, we must first have a nation strong enough to hold it." She met her father's eyes, then turned to William. "Let others argue about liberty and tyranny. You too must have a government steady enough that you can build, not merely defend." The fire answered with a sharp crack, sparks drifting up like fleeting stars. Outside, snow lay deep and silent, the world hushed under winter's weight. Within those sturdy walls, the debate flickered like the firelight itself, steady, uncertain, vital. Between them lay not only the fate of a constitution, but the choice of what kind of America they would carry with them westward into the wilderness. Nations, like families, are forged not in peace, but in the argument of what they are to become. From the warmth of one hearth, 1,000 new fires were imagined, each to light a single uncertain republic. Wedding Eve hush, February 1st, 1787, the Robinson home, Harrisburg. William Moffett's 24th birthday passed like a ghost, noticed, then gone. The parlour held the hush of evening, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and the clean, cool hint of freshly laundered linen. For this 1 hour, tomorrow's bustle was kept at bay. He stood beside Rebecca at the window, watching the last wash of sunset fade behind snow-dusted hills, the light bleeding slowly into the deep blue of night. "I was reading something in the Gazette that Maclay brought from Philadelphia," William said quietly, his voice a low warmth cutting through the stillness. "They say the Ohio and the Kentucky will be the great arteries of this new nation, that they'll carry our wheat and tobacco clear to New Orleans and on to the world." He turned toward her, eyes bright with that familiar gleam of vision she had long since come to love. "This land we're headed to, it's a place where the poorest man, if he's willing to work, can build his own competence. No landlord's boot on his neck, no coin paid to a king we never wanted. Just a man, his family, and the soil beneath his hands." Rebecca's smile softened as she rested her hand on the wedding gown draped carefully over the chair, dark blue linsey woolsey, the ribbon her mother had sewn, and the lace cap said to be the finest in Harrisburg. "A competence built on more than hope," she said quietly. "Built on good planning, fair prices, and honest labour, every barrel paying its way west." "Aye," he replied, his voice turning tender as he watched her fingers trace the gown's smooth fabric. "And what shall we tell our children," he asked, "about being wed by the fighting parson himself? Old Reverend Elder, the man who could bless a soul as quick as he could sight a rifle." She laughed softly, light and genuine. "We'll tell them he was a man who knew the truth of both callings, that to build a life or defend a frontier takes the same kind of courage, faith and fortitude." Her gaze swept the room, picturing tomorrow, the parlour filled shoulder to shoulder, or perhaps the great workroom in back if the weather turned fair. 30, maybe 32 guests, family and neighbours all. Her father's planning had allowed for both. Her mother and Hannah would lead the hymn, the Old Hundred, and for a moment Rebecca could almost hear it, rising through the rafters. Her eyes fell on the clothes she had laid out for William. A fine linen coat, breeches cut just below the knee, white stockings, and the new buckled shoes from the cobbler down the street. He had refused the powdered wig, and she loved him all the more for it. "We'll tell them," Rebecca said, turning back to him and taking his rough hands in hers, "that we began where it mattered most, here among family and prayers. In a house filled with love, and with a future as wide and open as the Kentucky sky. In each honest union lies the seed of a nation, and in every household, its first frontier, the diverging roads." Her steady hand. The wedding day had scarcely faded before the real work began. The house slept around them, only the kitchen hearth still glowed, its embers breathing a dull red warmth across the keeping-room floor. A single tallow candle burned on the table, its thin flame wavering whenever wind slipped through the shutters. The scent of wet ink lingered in the air, a promise still drying. William and Rebecca sat shoulder to shoulder, heads bent over the maps he had brought from William Maclay's study. The heavy paper crackled softly between their fingers, the long snaking trace of the wilderness road threading south through the Cumberland Gap, the old great wagon road winding down the Shenandoah like a tired rope, and newest of all, the bold brown line of the Ohio River, rising high with spring water, arrowing straight toward the heart of Kentucky. William's hand hovered above the southern routes, the roads his brothers had taken, the ones spoken of in every Ulster hearth tale as the way west. His fingertip traced them halfway, then stalled. Rebecca watched him for a long moment before placing her hand gently over his, stilling it. "No," she said, softly but certain. He looked up, startled. "We decided this the night we left Philadelphia," she went on, her voice calm, steady as the flame between them. "The Ohio, with Andrew Ellicott's party. 40 boats, maybe more, once the water rises. We'll not crawl over the gap with every other weary soul on a road rutted by broken axles and stripped bare by thieves." William's lips parted, old habit, old longing for the familiar trail, but she pressed on, green eyes bright in the half-dark. "Think, love. The gap is 2 to 3 months, 800 miles of mud and tolls, and Shawnee rifles behind every laurel thicket. One lame ox, one flooded creek, and we lose the season. The Ohio is 15 to 20 days overland, I'm told. 2 weeks to build our boat, 1 to 2 days to load it, and then, if the current holds, 7 to 14 days guarded by 100 rifles, and we'll land with our wagon whole and our silver unspent. She moved his hand from the southern line and laid it flat across the broad, unbroken ribbon of the river. This is the road we chose when we took Abraham's silver and spoke the thimble vow. We don't turn aside now, just because an older map feels safer. William stared at the river's curve, feeling its pull, swift, treacherous, new. The wilderness road was the dream of boys listening to old men's stories by the fire. The Ohio was for men and women who meant to arrive. He exhaled, long and slow, and with it let go the last of his hesitation. "Then the Ohio it is," he said quietly. Rebecca smiled, small, fierce, triumphant, and leaned forward to blow out the candle. Darkness folded around them, broken only by the red-breathing eye of the hearth. In that silence, with the river already rising in their thoughts, they folded away the old maps forever and turned their faces west, toward the one road that still shimmered like freedom. Marriage had changed him in ways he could scarcely name. Her steady presence reshaped his thinking. Under her quiet hand, his restless ambitions had become purpose. Doubt gave way to discipline, longing to direction. In her calm, he found not surrender, but a new kind of strength. Every road asks a price. The wiser heart pays it in faith. Letters and the Ledger. Harrisburg, cold evening of early March 1787. The fire had burned low, throwing long shadows across William Maclay's study. The tall senator sat with his stock unbuttoned, lace cuffs pushed back, a single candle guttering between them. Outside, the wind still carried the bite enough to rattle the windows. Maclay tapped the folded letter he had just sealed with a wafer of scarlet wax. "Levi Todd in Lexington will answer, if this reaches him," he said, voice quiet but edged with certainty. "He's married to John Todd's sister. Half the warrants in Fayette County pass through his hands. But letters drown, burn, or are read by the wrong eyes. So I'm giving you something surer." He slid a second paper across the desk, an introduction in his own careful hand. Andrew Ellicott, surveyor. The Virginia office trusts his chain and compass more than most men's oaths. William responds, "He's the same Andrew my blacksmith friend, Mac Allister, introduced to me at the City Tavern in Philadelphia. Maclay, he'll be laying out the new road west come April. Travel with him. Let him vouch for you when you reach the Ohio." William took the letter, feeling the thick rag paper, the weight of a promise. Maclay leaned forward, firelight catching the silver in his hair. "But the real key is still Virginian. I sat beside George Wythe in Philadelphia these last months, the old chancellor himself. When I asked who truly holds Kentucky in his fist, he gave me one name, James Garrard, Fayette County surveyor. Garrard appoints every deputy from the Salt River to the Kentucky. A nod from him, and your warrant is recorded clean. A shrug, and it vanishes like smoke." Maclay's eyes fixed on William, steady and grave. "Paper will get you to the wilderness, Mr. Moffett. Only a man's hand in yours will get you the land." William folded both letters inside his coat, right beside Rebecca's thimble. "Then we'll ride with Ellicott," he said. "And when we stand on Kentucky ground, we'll find Garrard. And we'll look him in the eye when we shake on it." Maclay allowed himself the smallest smile. "That's the spirit that will plant your plough deeper than any lawyer's quill." Outside, the wind dropped for a moment, as though the night itself had paused to listen. Inside, the candle burned straight and steady, and two men, one in lace, one in plain wool, sealed a bargain that needed no wax at all, but a claim was useless without the means to reach it. One evening, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of Rebecca's loom provided the backdrop to their planning. "We need oxen," William stated, the words solid and practical. No horse can pull a loaded Conestoga over the mountains. It must be oxen. Rebecca's hands never stilled, but her mind was already calculating. The cost of a yoke, their feed for the journey. It is a greater sum, but a necessary one. She looked up from her ledger, her gaze meeting his. It is the first line in the ledger of our new life. We cannot afford a false entry. Trusting her numbers and his own knowledge of wood and iron, William travelled 30 miles downstream to the German settlement of north of Lancaster. Well worth the 4 hours' travel. The air in Christian Roth's workshop was a potent mix of fresh sawn oak, pine pitch, hot linseed oil, and the smelted, acrid fumes of the forge shaping the iron bands. The sound was a symphony of creation, the rhythmic strike of mallets, the shaving of a draw-knife shaping a spoke, the hiss of hot metal being hardened by the cold water. Roth himself, a man with forearms like knotted rope, showed William a wagon frame that was a thing of brutal strength and elegant craftsmanship. "The Allegheny ridges will splinter a weak wheel," Roth said, his German accent thick as he tapped an iron-bound wheel that rang like a bell. "My rollers, they outlast any other by 500 miles. He pointed to a tiny CR carved into a spoke, his trademark. William ran a hand over the smooth, sturdy wood, feeling the solid promise of it. This was not just a wagon, it was their ark. He placed the order, paying in hard silver, the coin cold and heavy in his palm. As they left the workshop, the scent of wood smoke and industry clinging to their clothes, William felt the thimble in his waistcoat pocket, a cool, hard circle of promise. Rebecca's wisdom had secured the capital. His own resolve was building the vessel. The journey was no longer a dream. It was a plan, measured in miles, silver, and the unwavering strength of a Roth-built roller. Maclay's candle had burned steady, now Roth's iron rang true. Thimble, letters, and wagon-bound, their road west, no longer dream, but deed. Salt lick and sorrow, the letter. The sharp scent of a coming frost still clung to Rebecca's cloak as she entered the house, her cheeks flushed from the cold. In her hand she held a packet, its paper worn and softened from its long journey. "William," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet of their planning. "Caleb, the ferryman, had this for you. It was left at the sign of the Bear." William took the packet, his brow furrowed. In an age before a reliable post, letters were living things, passed from rider to boatman to tavern keeper, their survival a small miracle. This one had found its way from the depths of Kentucky. The name on the outside sent a jolt through him, Captain Robert Moffett. A name held deep from his father's stories, a cousin he knew only by distant reputation. His brothers had left to the wilderness with men that served Robert Moffett, headed for the Clinch River Rycova to link up with Captain Moffett. They parted ways in Philadelphia a few days after arriving. That was the last time William saw or heard from his two brothers. He broke the wax seal, the sound a sharp crack in the silent room. Rebecca drew closer, her presence a quiet reassurance as he read the sprawling script aloud. October 17th, 1786. Fayette County, Kentucky. My dearest cousin William, I pray this letter finds you and your new bride Rebecca in good health. I received word from our kin in Belfast of your marriage to Margaret Robinson's daughter, a fine match, and a binding of our line to the Trimbles once more. It is with a heavy heart that I must first convey sorrowful news. We were blessed to have your brothers, David and Thomas, in good spirits upon their arrival. But fortune is a fickle mistress. Young Thomas was thrown from his horse in a wooded gully this past spring. His head struck a fallen log. He did not suffer. He rests now in Kentucky soil. David remains with me, a steadfast partner in our endeavors, and it is he who urged me to write this. Now, to the purpose of my letter, which I hope will serve as a balm to your grief. Understanding your intent to seek land here, David and I have acted as your agents. We have secured a prime tract of 200 acres on your behalf, staked its bounds, and raised a crude cabin and stable to satisfy the requirement of improvement. My own surveyor has filed the preliminary warrant with the land office in your name. Consider this our wedding gift to you both. A start. The land is fertile, with a reliable creek and good timber. My own homestead lies 28 miles to the northeast, and our mutual connection, Captain James Trimble, holds adjacent lands. We have been meticulous, ensuring this parcel is unencumbered by prior military warrants. Furthermore, to strengthen your claim and your future prosperity, we have secured for you a share in a salt discovery near the Salt Lick. This valuable interest has already helped to expedite your patent. I enclose a rough map with landmarks noted the Twin Oaks, the Redstone Bluff, the Cherokee Trail. It will guide you. When you reach Lexington, inquire for me or for James Trimble at the surveyor's office. Any man there can point you the rest of the way. My wife Jane and I eagerly await the day we can welcome you to our table. We shall expect a full account of your adventures along the Susquehanna and the Wilderness Road. Your faithful kinsman, Captain Robert Moffett. Rebecca's hand found William's. Steady as the thimble in his pocket, grief for Thomas now salted with 200 acres and kin waiting beyond the Ohio. Spero meliora, the grace of God himself. The last of the winter's grip was a grimy, retreating ice in the shadows, but the early March sun held a new, tentative warmth. Inside the Robinson home, the air was thick with the scent of simmering stew, and the faint, clean smell of wet wool drying by the hearth. Rebecca stood before William, her hands resting on her middle, her face a mixture of trepidation and a fierce, quiet joy. William. Her voice was different, softer. A note he'd never heard before that stilled the air in the room. He looked up from the new map spread across the table, the ink lines of Kentucky forgotten instantly. Her hands were clasped gently over her middle, a secret smile playing on her lips that held both wonder and a trace of fear. "The Lord is setting another place at our table," she whispered, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "We'll likely see a new face. By October." William's breath caught. He searched her face, the reality dawning on him like a sudden brilliant sunrise. "A wee bairn?" he asked, his own voice hushed with awe. "Yes," Rebecca breathed, the single word a world of promise. For a moment, William was motionless, the immense weight and joy of it settling in his soul. Then his gaze shot upward, as if he could see straight through the roof beams to the heavens. "Spero meliora," he whispered, a fervent prayer for better things to come. "God, grace us now." He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her face in his rough hands as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. "Och, Mo Creed," he murmured, his Scots burr thick with emotion. "You have blessed us." The words hung in the air, as tangible as the hearth's heat on their skin. A bairn? The profound news from Captain Moffett, a brother lost, a legacy of land secured, was suddenly reframed, eclipsed by a future that was both more immediate and terrifyingly precious. The maps and ledgers that had once charted an abstract dream were no longer mere plans. They had become the blueprint for their child's world. In William's mind, a silent, fierce vow took root, his thoughts turning in the Scots brogue of his father. "We cannae allow a single thing to go astray now. There's nae room for failure in this. I will nae entertain the thought, and I will nae abide the result." From that moment, a new and sharper urgency took hold of them. It drove William to become a constant presence in Christian Roth's workshop, where the air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut oak and the sharp smell of pine pitch. He would lay a hand on the growing frame of the Roth roller, feeling the solid, unyielding promise of it, the iron bands cool and sure beneath his palm. This was no longer just a wagon for a journey. It was their child's cradle on wheels, taking them safely to Kentucky for the first sturdy walls of the home they would build together. One evening, as Rebecca updated her ledger by candlelight, the yellow flame flickering across her determined face, she made her first formal claim. "The Loom House, William," she stated, her quill pausing. "It must be the first entry on our list for Kentucky, before a pantry, before a root cellar. I need a roof under which I can keep us warm and make our blankets and clothes." The following week, her father, William Robinson, led them out to the barn, where the earthy smell of hay and animal musk was strong. 2 massive oxen, their breath pluming in the chill air, stood patiently, their great horns like polished wood. "This is your dowry," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. He clapped a hand on William's shoulder. "And Rebecca, your mother's family helped put up the silver for your first 200 acres. He gestured to a corner of the barn, where a large loom and spinning jenny stood, silent and ready for travel. "We'll send the wool from our 42 sheep, late spring, after the lambing. If I'm any judge, that should give you near 168 pounds of wool to see you through until you've settled your own drove." The gift was staggering. It was not just animals and wool. It was a complete economy in miniature, a tangible vote of confidence that filled the crisp air with the scent of hope and fresh-turned earth. The path to Kentucky was no longer a dream. It was a road, paved with love and secured by a legacy of practical wisdom, waiting for their wheels to roll. The oxen lowed softly in the barn, their breath mingling with hay scent and the wool to come, while Rebecca's hand cradled their future. From Thimblebow to Roth's rollers, maps to maternity, their road west now carried not dreams, but the weight of Spero Meliora, better things, God willing, by Kentucky's first frost. Moffett clan motto, Spero Meliora. The weight of the thimble. Harrisburg, the Ides of March, 1787. The wind still carried teeth, but the river had begun to swell with the first dark promise of spring. 25 fresh hogsheads stood on the ferry landing like soldiers in a row, iron hoops gleaming, the sharp smell of new white oak rising from their staves. William ran a hand along the topmost barrel, feeling the perfect bite of the crows, the slight spring in the hoops that told him they would never weep a drop of Abraham Overholt's rye. The Roth Conestoga waited in the yard, nearly finished now, broad wheels, tall bows, the canvas still smelling of new hemp. Soon it would carry them west. But was it the right way west? He turned to the ferryman, John Harris, Jr., who stood coatless in the raw air, arms folded, watching the brown water slide past. "2 roads to Kentucky, Mr. Harris," William said, voice low so the deck hands would not hear. "Cumberland Gap by wagon, or the Ohio by boat. Which is the surer?" Harris spat into the current and laughed once, short as a musket crack. "Forget the Gap, unless ye fancy breaking axles on the Wilderness Road and feeding your oxen to the Shawnees. The Ohio's your highway, now high water coming. And a Boston merchant name of John May is building 20, maybe 40 boats at Redstone for a late April launch. Craig's and Tomlinson's have the yards humming. You'll find them at the point, hammering oak like the world's ending. Good men, fair prices? Pay in silver. Mine paper drowns quicker than a drunk riverman." William nodded, the numbers already turning in his head. $50 for a bosun to the falls, 100 clean to New Orleans. He felt the weight of the coin belt against his ribs, heavy and cold. Harris leaned closer, voice dropping to the growl men use when they speak of things that stain the soul. "You'll need more than a bosun, lad. You've a wife breeding 2 months gone. Unless my eyes fail me, Kentucky ground don't clear itself, and a cabin don't raise itself before snow flies. I've a prime couple coming up from Pittsburgh tomorrow, man and woman, young, strong. He's a cooper by trade, learned the stave in Virginia, quick as any white man I ever saw. She's handy with kettle and needle, gentle with women in the family way. They'll load your boat, steer it, raise your walls, and never a complaint." William's stomach turned, but he did not look away. "Cost?" Harris grinned like a man offering a bargain on flour. 25 hogsheads same as these. I'll take 'em off your hands and sell the whiskey in 'em myself. Saves your silver for the thieves farther down river." He clapped William on the shoulder, fingers hard as oak knots. "Ride high water, boy. Cold, frozen mud on the wagon road. Colder graves if you wait too long on a falling river. And keep that cantslope a buttoned April wind'll cut a man to the marrow." The ferry horn sounded, low and mournful. William stepped aboard, the 25 hogsheads rolling behind him like dull thunder. The thimble in his pocket, Rebecca's thimble, pressed against his heart, small and merciless. Across the widening water he could already see the road branching, one path of iron hoops and human chains, the other of high water and desperate hope. By the time the far bank rose to meet him, he knew which he would have to walk, and which he would have to justify to the woman whose child now grew beneath her ribs. The Ohio waited, wide and treacherous, and the Bourbon line was no longer just barrels of rye. Harris's prime couple lingered in his ears, silver saved, but souls bartered, while Rebecca's thimble burned small and merciless against his heart. We hated together, 25 hogsheads. Harrisburg, a raw evening in late March 1787. The Robinson house hunkered low against the last spiteful blasts of winter, shutters latched tight, the chimney coughing pale smoke that carried the sharp, resinous bite of stave scraps and half-seasoned oak wood they had meant to save for next year, now burning because the cold refused to loosen its grip. Every morning the river ice groaned and cracked a little more. Every evening the wind still knifed down from the ridges, but the days were stretching, the light lingering, and everyone in the house felt the same restless pull. Spring was coming. The Ohio would rise, and if they missed the high water, they would lose a whole year. The river already muttering about high water, and Rebecca's waist just beginning to thicken beneath her apron. Rebecca sat at her wheel, treadle moving faster than it had all winter, as though the rhythm itself could hurry the season along. Every day lost to lingering frost was a day closer to missing the flotilla, to arriving in Kentucky too late for planting, to starting a life one season behind. Yet in that small circle of firelight, with the wind rattling the shutters one last time before spring, they felt the old house holding its breath with them ready, at last, to let them go. Inside the keeping room, the hearth glowed sullen red, throwing restless shadows across the lime-washed walls. A single horn lantern burned on the table, its flame steady in the close air, giving off the faint, oily scent of whale fat and the warmer promise of journey's beginning. Rebecca sat at the wheel, treadle creaking softly as she drew flax into thread, her apron dusted with the day's flour from helping Phoebe in the kitchen. Returning from Philadelphia, William came in from the yard, coat slung over one arm, boots leaving wet prints on the puncheon floor. He hung the coat by the fire, steam rising from the wool as it warmed, and stood a moment with his back to her, hands spread to the heat. The urgency sat between them like an uninvited guest, the Conestoga nearly finished. The hogsheads promised to Harris and Overholt weighed heavy on William's mind. Rebecca's wheel slowed. She knew that Stant's shoulders tight, head bowed like a man carrying invisible chains. "Out! With it, William," she said, voice soft but unyielding. "Ye've the look of a man who's swallowed a stone." He turned then, blue eyes meeting hers in the lantern light. The thimble in his pocket pressed against his chest like a reminder. "Sat with Harris at the ferry a week ago," he began, pulling out a chair and sitting heavy. 25 hogsheads he wants. Our best white oak, 6-hooped, for sale to Abraham Bomberger of Newmanstown ye old limestone distillery. He has a trade going on there as well. Rebecca's brow furrowed. 25. Harris isn't keeping the barrels for himself. He's trading them straight across to Abraham Bomberger at the old limestone distillery in Newmanstown. Bomberger's laying down a big rye run this spring. Needs tight hogsheads he can trust. Harris gets the whiskey at a cut rate, sells it up and down the river for hard coin. We've 15 ready now. The rest by April's end? Aye. But that's not the half. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping low. He took 'em in trade, Rebecca. Not silver. Her hand stilled on the wheel. Trade for what? William drew a slow breath that tasted of smoke and reluctance. Hands. A couple from Virginia Way. Man and wife. He's a cooper trained in Richmond, knows the stave better than most. She's strong, handy with spinning wheel and childbed. Harris says she'll ease your burden when the bairn comes. The word bairn hung between them, soft as the lantern's glow. Rebecca's hand went unconsciously to her belly, still flat but alive with the secret they both carried. Hands, she repeated, the word flat and heavy. Ye mean slaves. William's jaw tightened. Aye. I walked the landing 3 times before I shook on it, told myself it was for you, for the child, for the land that won't break itself. But it's a chain, Rebecca, no matter how we dress it. She rose then, crossed to him, and laid her hands on his shoulders, warm, steady, the fingers that kept their ledgers straight now kneading the knots in his back. 25. Barrels, she murmured, thinking aloud. 15 ready, 10 more by the full moon if we work the yard double. And for that, help we can trust on the river and in the clearing. William reached up, covered her hand with his. He says the man's quick with a draw-knife, the woman's gentle as Phoebe. But I hate it, Rebecca. Like buying a piece of Ulster all over again. She bent, pressed her lips to the crown of his head, tasting the salt of the day's sweat. We hate it together, she said. But Kentucky won't wait for our consciences to catch up. We'll treat 'em fair, better than fair. And when the land's ours, we'll find a way to make it right. The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, with the deal struck and the barrels waiting, they sat a long while in the lantern's circle, hands clasped, planning a future that already bore its first dark mark. The house had let go. In the silent wake of their decision, the howling wind outside seemed to shift from a spiteful blast to a summoning call. It no longer rattled shutters trying to keep winter out. It whistled through the cracks of the life they were preparing to leave. The sanctuary of lime-washed walls and firelight had done its last service, not by keeping the cold out, but by holding the echo of their concession, "We hate it together." As they sat, clasp-handed in the lantern's circle, they were no longer just planning a future. They were already inhabiting its first compromised room. The house released them not into innocence, but into consequence. Titus and Nan, the Ravens' farewell. Early April 1787. The yard behind the cooperage was alive with the smell of fresh-shaved oak and wet earth, the ground still soft from the night's rain. High in the bare maples that lined the ridge, ravens gathered in a black, quarrelsome flock, dozens of them, wings flashing glossy purple in the thin sunlight, their harsh metallic cores rolling down like gravel poured from a bucket. They scolded the world below, hopping from branch to branch, tails flicking, as though they alone knew the folly of men planning journeys in spring mud. William stood beside the new Roth Conestoga, coat thrown open despite the chill, placing the rig in and bowed yoke he had reshaped the evening before. The wagon was built for 4 oxen, but he had seen too many families lose a season to a lame beast or a flooded trace. 6 would pull them steady, 6 strong beasts to haul the heavy barrels, the iron-bound chests, the ploughs and seed corn and tools to build a home. He had worked by lantern light after supper, planing the yoke longer, boring new holes for the boughs, thickening the beam where the extra strain would fall. The wood still bore the pale scars of his adze, smelling sharp and clean. 6 oxen meant slower turns on narrow traces, but it also meant arriving with goods intact and families safe. William also thought of the rigging he would need should they have to use oxen to pull them over sandbars and shallow river areas. His strength and now would be teamed with Titus. They would build pulleys to be used and store rope and chain. Rebecca had watched him from the doorway, one hand on her rounding belly, saying nothing, just nodding once when he held the finished yoke up to the light. Now, in the Raven chorus morning, he fitted the first bough, the oxen's breath steaming in the cold as Rebecca's father held the animals steady. The birds overhead kept up their racket, as though laughing at the stubborn hope of men who thought they could outpull winter, outrun spring floods, and outbuild the wilderness itself. William tightened the last pin, stepped back, and looked at the wagon, broad wheels sunk an inch in the mud, canvas tight as a drum, 6 patient beasts waiting for the word. The team was complete. Late March 1787, the trade at Harris's Ferry. The ravens wheeled once more above the yard, cawing their coarse prophecy before scattering west ahead of the wind, straight toward the Ohio, as if marking the way. William drew a slow, full breath, tasting sawdust and river damp in the morning air. Then he turned toward the house. "It's time," he called. By mid-morning, The Conestoga stood ready, its bed heavy with the first 15 hogsheads, iron hoops gleaming, the scent of fresh-cut white oak rising sharp and clean in the sun. William snapped the reins. The 6 oxen leaned into their broad yoke, a thing he had widened and shaped by hand, and the wagon creaked forward, great wheels biting deep into the soft March yard. Rebecca rode beside him on the high box seat, her shawl loose now that the sun had some warmth. One hand rested lightly on the curve no one else had yet named aloud. They reached Harris's ferry landing, as the river caught full light, high, brown and restless, water rising from the spring's early mountain snowmelt. On the wharf, John Harris Jr. stood waiting, coat open to the wind, arms folded like a man who had seen every bargain the water ever carried. 15 on the nose, Harris said, giving the nearest barrel a solid clap. Bomberger'll be pleased. His rye's ready to lay down, and these will keep it sweet. William jumped down, boots striking the planks. 10 more by the new moon, he said. As agreed, Harris grinned, sharp and wide. And here's the rest of our agreement. He nodded toward the shed behind the ferry office. Its door swung open, and out stepped Titus first, a tall man, near 6 feet, shoulders broad as the wagon yoke and eyes steady as planed oak. Behind him came Nan, small and deliberate, a bundle clutched to her chest, kerchief tied neat beneath her chin. Her gaze moved quick over the wagon, the oxen, then to the couple who waited by the river. William felt the familiar tightness coil in his chest, but he met Titus's eyes square. "William Moffett," he said, offering his hand. "This is Rebecca." Titus clasped it. Callus to callus, grip firm and even. "Titus," he answered. Then, after a pause, his voice softened. "And Disjerenan." Rebecca climbed carefully down from the seat, mindful of her balance, her face gentle and open. She met Nan's wary gaze with a small, steady smile, the kind she saved for frightened creatures or new beginnings. "Welcome," she said softly. "We've room in the wagon, and a warm house waiting." The river wind flapped the edge of her shawl, carrying the mingled scents of oak, rye and thawing earth, the smell of work, of promise, of the first motion toward the frontier. Harris laughed and turned away to inspect the barrels, leaving the 4 of them in the sudden quiet of the landing. The river slapped the pilings. The ride back was mostly silent, the oxen plodding steady when they rolled into the Robinson yard at last. Phoebe was on the step sorting dried beans, Hannah beside her peeling potatoes. Phoebe's face broke open like sunrise. "Law, come here." She enfolded Nan in arms that smelled of wood smoke and good soap, then reached for Titus with the same unhesitating welcome. "You're home now, both of you. This house don't hold with cold corners." Hannah hung back a shy second, then darted forward to take Nan's bundle. "Loft's aired and ready," she said, voice bright. "And supper's rabbit stew, Miss Rebecca's favourite." Inside, Margaret greeted them with quiet dignity, pressing cups of hot cider into cold hands and directing chairs by the hearth. When the talk turned to the journey west, Phoebe leaned close to Nan. "These two," she said, nodding toward William and Rebecca, "they'll treat you right. Seen it already. Master will work till he drops, and Miss Rebecca, she's got a heart big enough for the whole river. You'll be family with them, soon as the road lets you." Titus listened, eyes on the fire, but Nan's shoulders eased a fraction. Later, when the women had gone to settle Nan in the loft, William led Titus out to the cooperage shed. The air smelled of shaved oak and pitch. Lantern lights slid across half-finished staves, waiting for the draw-knife. 10 more to raise," William said, handing Titus a hollowing knife. "We'll work side by side till they're done. Then we load the wagon and ride to deliver them." Titus tested the blade's edge with his thumb, nodding slow approval. William met his eyes again. "You and Nan, you're not tools to me. You'll eat at our table, sleep under our roof, work the land beside us. When the deed's clear and the crop's in, we'll find the way to make you free on it." "My word, Titus, as God hears me." Titus held his gaze a long moment, the lantern flame steady between them. "Yo word," he said at last, voice low. "I gon' hole you to dat." They bent to the staves then. the rhythmic scrape of steel on oak filling the shed. 2 men building barrels that would carry more than just the whiskey. Building, too, the fragile first timbers of trust. Outside, the wind had finally turned mild, and the river kept rising patient and strong, ready to take them all. The ravens wheeled west one final time, their gravel-voiced prophecy fading into the mild wind as the river rose patient and strong. Titus's drawknife scraped steady beside William's in the lantern-lit shed, forging barrels, and trust for the high water ahead. From Ravenscorn to family hearth, their road carried oak, oath, and the weight of words held between men. Yo word, I gon' hole you to dat. Parlour full of pioneers. 22 April 1787, the day of our Lord. The sun didn't rise so much as it crawled, bleeding a pale, watery gold warmth across the frost-rimed fields behind the Robinson house. The old oak tree by the creek, now a skeleton against the brightening sky, the conspiracy of ravens had ended their parliament and flown, leaving silence to the red-winged blackbirds. Their sharp, slurred whistle, "O Carly," cut the chill air as they darted through the tall green grasses of the canal bank, staking their urgent tiny claims to the coming spring. The morning's fragile quiet now shattered with a sound like rolling thunder. From the south, a great, groaning caravan emerged, churning the road into a plume of pale dust that hung in the still air like smoke. The ground trembled beneath the rhythmic, earth-shaking thump of countless hooves. 4 massive Conestoga wagons, their arched white canvases glowing in the low light like the sails of landships, lumbered into view. Behind them the dust cloud trailed like the wake of an approaching army. "William!" Rebecca's voice cut through the clamour from within the house. He joined her at the window, their breath fogging the cold glass. There was Samuel MacAllister, unmistakable even at a distance, standing tall on the lead wagon seat, with Martha beside him, her bonnet a bright spot of colour. Behind them came Andrew Ellicott, and beside him the graceful figure of his wife, Patience Biddle Ellicott, followed by wagons full of their kin and belongings. Laughter, rich, travelling worn, and full of relief, carried on the breeze, mingling with the shouts of teamsters and the creak of 100 stressed timbers. A sudden, galvanizing energy surged through the Robinson home. Phoebe, her hands already dusted with flour, called to Nan and Hannah, her voice rising above the growing clamour outside. "The coffee pot! Fetch the big one, and we'll need every plate." "I have extra biscuit dough ready," Phoebe said, already wiping her hands on her apron and moving with a purpose that set the floorboards to creaking. Nan, her movements quiet and efficient, nodded. "In Virginia, we make a gravy from fresh cream and bacon fat," she offered, her voice soft but clear. "It would be good over the biscuits." The warm, savoury scent of that idea seemed to materialize in the kitchen air, promising comfort. Rebecca and Margaret were already on the porch, shawls pulled tight against the morning's bite, their faces alight with welcome. Across the yard, William, Robinson and Titus were directing the great wagons onto the flat ground near the barns, their shouts mingling with the snorts and stomps of the lathered oxen. The air grew thick with the smells of damp earth kicked up by wheels, the pungent odour of animal sweat, and the dry, sweet scent of hay from the barns. As Rebecca watched the travellers pour from the wagons, stretching stiff limbs and turning their faces to the weak sun, the vast, daunting distance to the Ohio River seemed to collapse. The wilderness had sent its scouts, its vanguard. The journey was no longer a solitary dream sketched on a map. It was here, in their yard, real and breathing, smelling of dust, animals, and hope. The Ohio, for the first time, didn't feel like a distant mystery. It felt like the next bend in this road journey they were now all sharing. What they were not short of was laughter and warmth. The morning sun dawned across the fleeting frost, silvering the fields, melting quick as red-winged blackbirds trilled their conquests from the greening canals. Grass blades pushed stubborn through the yard's soft mud, whispering of full spring to come. Conestogas from the MC Alister and Ellicott kin dotted the Robinson property like patient beasts, their canvas dew-heavy, while Samuel, Martha, Andrew Ellicott, with his wife Patience Biddle Ellicott, and their travelling folk converged on the house just an hour past sunrise. William Robinson and Titus wrestled the repurposed hogshead from the supply wagon, iron hoops slick with dew, water sloshing deep inside like a waking river. The faint smell of seasoned oak staves mingled with the mineral kiss of well water, and the fresh, loamy breath of thawing earth. Nearby, a handcart groaned under precious fodder, sun-dried meadow grass bundles crackling crisp, dusty parsnips and fodder beets from the root cellar, golden Indian corn kernels rattling like distant thunder when Titus scooped them. No starving time threatened now. Spring's green tide would soon flood the hollows. From the porch, Margaret's voice rang clear over the low ox calls and blackbird song. "Leave that and come eat, all of you." Breath fogging faintly in the crisp air, she waved toward the path beyond the barns. "Necessaries yonder. Mind the geese. They'll have your shins." Inside, the parlour hummed with close, joyful chaos, an hour's work since dawn stretching the great oak table extensions to breaking. Worn planks vanished under mismatched cloths, flowered damask, checked homespun, a corner of sailcloth for the overflow. Chairs fell short amid the crowd, but William and Titus hauled in benches from the cooperage, their surfaces smooth-worn, carrying the morning's chill and pine-pitch whisper. Yet all senses bowed to the house's reigning aromas. Ham sizzled fierce in the skillet, fat sizzling and popping. Nan's bacon gravy bubbled creamy and thick, its savoury cloak rising triumphant. It wove with Phoebe's hearth-hot biscuits, golden, feather-light, and the bold, nutty steam of coffee perked strong. The aromas struck like a physical balm, thawing journey-weary bones, wrapping MC Alisters, Ellicotts, and the rest in promise of full bellies and fuller hearts. They squeezed onto benches and chairs, elbows knocking like old friends at a barn dance, shoulders meeting in a friendly crush of wool and homespun. Mugs of coffee and cider clinked a tinny percussion against thick crockery bowls, and spoons scraped a happy rhythm against their bottoms. Then the real symphony began, a low, warm murmur of voices that bloomed into a joyful chaos of overlapping sound. Tales were traded about the coming flotilla, questions flying back and forth. Jokes rose above the din, first at the expense of Andrew the surveyor, who'd famously taken a wrong turn and tried to map his way out of a Philadelphia alley. But the true crescendo came with the story of Samuel and the ox, how he tried to wrestle the great beast onto its back to fit its new iron shoes, shouting for help while the beast flipped Samuel on his back, unimpressed. How, in the frantic dance, he'd tripped over his own anvil, the very symbol of his strength, and landed flat in the wagon bed, much to the ox's apparent amusement. The laughter that followed didn't just fill the room, it became the room. It erupted in great rolling waves, a thunderous, belly-shaking force that seemed to lift the very rafters. The deep, booming guffaws of the men met the bright, shattering peals from the women, while the pure, unburdened giggles of children wove through it all like sparkling threads in a rich, warm amity of joy. For a long while, the hard journey, the cold, and the uncertain future were all forgotten, chased away by the mightiest sound on the frontier, the sound of a family, chosen and born, laughing itself breathless. No fine china gleamed, no silver shone, space was rationed tighter than salt pork. Yet in that sun-sliced parlour, gravy steaming, ham hissing, biscuits torn steaming from the cloth, blackbirds carolling faint outside, no lack shadowed them. Frost fled the fields, the Ohio whispered high water, and here, shoulder to shoulder with Mac Allisters and Ellicotts, Moffetts, and the Robinsons' table brimmed not just with food, but with the deep, rafter-rattling warmth of lives braided for the road ahead. Red-winged blackbirds had trilled their urgent claims through the morning chill, ravens' conspiracy scattered. Now the parlour rang with a bolder music, laughter erupting in gusts, voices overlapping like kin, the vanguard gathered tight against the wilderness ahead. Tavern talk and the Constitution's shadow. April 23rd, 1787. Preparations. The tavern at the Sign of the Bear hummed with life on that cool, damp evening in late April 1787, just days before William Moffett's caravan would roll out along the muddy Forbes Road toward the Ohio River. Smoke from the great hearth curled thick and blue through the low-beamed ordinary, carrying the sharp smell of burning hickory and the richer, mouth-watering aromas of roasting pork, boiled cabbage, and fresh-baked cornbread slathered with dripping butter. The air was heavy with the yeasty scent of ale-soaked oak tables. It had an earthy musk of wet wool cloaks hanging near the fire to dry. Laughter and raised voices bounced off the ordinary's walls. Pewter tankards clinked. Chair legs scraped across the wide plank floor, and somewhere in the corner a fiddler sawed out a lively reel that set boots tapping and rowel spurs jingling. Supper that night was a rare respite for Nan, Phoebe, and Hannah. The men had declared they would take their meal at the Bear, giving the women and children a quiet evening to bond back at the Robinsons. It also allowed the travellers, Andrew, Samuel, William, and the others, to lay out the final details of the long road ahead. They discussed, checking harness, counting powder and lead, and confirming every soul was set for the grueling weeks to come. Andrew's brother-in-law, Johann Adam, newly arrived from the east, slid onto the bench beside them, his cloak still beaded with spring rain. Samuel lifted his foaming tankard, the cool pewter pleasant against his calloused palm, and called out over the noise, "Let us drink to our new friendship and our bold enterprise westward. By God's grace, may the road find us safe and in Kentucky by July." The Bear buzzed louder than usual that night. Word was sweeping through every settlement in the new states. Congress had endorsed a grand convention to meet in Philadelphia on the second Monday in May to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. States were appointing delegates and issuing careful instructions. It was no surprise, then, that William Maclay, tall, sharp-eyed, and ever the politician, soon appeared at their table, his boots leaving faint tracks of mud on the floorboards. Andrew, who had met Maclay years before in Philadelphia, grinned and said, "You are tardy, sir." "I crave your pardon," Maclay replied, bowing slightly. "Let me not trouble you." Samuel waved him in at once. "Sir, please, join us and share in our regale." Maclay settled onto the bench, the heat of the nearby fire warming his damp coat. "It is good that William has found you, Andrew." Young William Moffett looked up from his plate, lips twisting into a sour smile as he listened to what he privately judged laughable commentary. Maclay leaned forward, voice low but clear over the tavern clamour. "I explained to young William how the survey and land warrant business in Kentucky, a wild west of litigation, is yet to come. Every settler heading down the Ohio seems to think he can stake whatever ground pleases him and ignore the laws of this new nation." Andrew wiped ale from his lip and answered steadily, "That is precisely why I am in such demand, sir. The rest of the ordinary here may not agree. They seem more exercised about expelling the Articles of Confederation altogether. They want a country with proper representation. Without a strong new constitution, we leave ourselves open to France, Spain, or England swooping in to claim whatever they fancy." Maclay cleared his throat, the sound rough against the crackle of the fire. "I beg your pardon, good sir. But the convention of delegates come the second Monday in May will find solutions to protect us, even if it means setting aside the Articles. Let us not judge before they convene." He paused, as Samuel cleared his throat as an interruption to speak, then taking a slow pull from the tankard, Samuel pushed toward him, the bitter ale sharp on his tongue. "You have it on good authority that the Articles will not falter until the new Constitution has been argued, agreed upon, and ratified by each state in our Union." "Maclay," replied Sir, "Samuel, if I may, the Confederation Congress will continue to meet and act under the Articles until we have something better." Samuel leaned in, brow furrowed. "Will it pass with no Bill of Rights?" Maclay gave a wry smile. "That will not come until the new Congress under the new Constitution is seated." Maclay turns to William. "William, this is why I tell ye, make certain your land warrants are recorded both in Virginia and down in Lexington. There will be blood over land. Kentucky remains the dark and bloody ground. The Indians fought over it long before we Scots-Irish decided we wanted it for ourselves. The Wyandots still call it Ka Ten Tate, land where we will live tomorrow." He pushed back his bench, the legs scraping loudly. "Well, gentlemen, enjoy your company. It is time for me to retire." The table fell quiet for a moment after Macleigh's departure, the tavern noise swelling around them again, laughter, the hiss of fat still dripping into the fire, the clatter of plates being cleared. Andrew spoke first, voice low and earnest. "Samuel, William, there is much truth in what he said. Kentucky has not yet adopted the Land Ordinance of 1785 passed by the Confederation Congress. That ordinance will stand and be used to settle every state along the Ohio. Due to the commissions that must still be completed, my passage with you ends at Pittsburgh. You must inquire carefully that whichever surveyor you hire follows the new federal standard, or you may lose your land altogether." Both William and Samuel exchanged uneasy glances. They had never considered such complications when they first dreamed of this journey. From Ulster the tales had always been simple. Stake out your lines, plant your corn. The land was empty, belonging to no one. Samuel turned to William, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. "You know, I think you'd be wise to yoke 4 oxen on the tongue and let 2 more walk behind as spares. Give your wheelers a chance to rest now and then. You can always put a full yoke of 6 together when you need the power for climbing those mountains." William's dream of owning land had seemed so much closer when he left Ulster, but the road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty at every turn. Yet he would not falter. He had Rebecca and a child on the way. It fell to him to keep them safe and build a farm that would provide them lasting comfort. As the last blue curls of hearth smoke vanished up the chimney at the sign of the Bear, William gripped his tankard and steeled himself for the muddy Forbes road ahead. Mocridy's Vow, April 2006, 1787. The journey and remorse. On the eve of their departure, their small chamber seemed too still, the air heavy with the scent of freshly dipped beeswax candles and the faint lingering smoke of the hearth clinging to the rafters. Rebecca lay upon the narrow bed, her body curled beneath her mother's patched quilt, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Her eyes, great, stricken pools of sorrow, fixed upon William, as though he alone could anchor her to the life she must leave behind, her mother's gentle hands, her father's quiet stories, the familiar streets of Harrisburg that had shaped her every breath. William knelt beside her. She confessed her fears, and the tears were like a river down her cheeks, William's thumb brushing away the tears with a tenderness that belied the strength in his frame. "Hush now, Mocreed," he murmured, voice low and soft with feeling. He drew her close until her breasts pressed soft and warm against his chest, the thin linen of her shift no barrier to the quickening beat of their hearts. His hand moved of its own accord, tracing the curve of her side, then rising to cup the fullness of her breast. They had changed since the bairn quickened within her, firmer, heavier, ripe with promise, and the touch drew a soft, shuddering moan from her lips. She wept still, but the sound mingled now with desire, her body arching instinctively toward him, welcoming what had been too long denied amid worry and preparation. Rebecca's fingers trembled as they found the front of his breeches, stroking the hard length of him through the fabric. William stilled, breath catching. "The bairn," he whispered, a note of hesitation in his voice, fear for their unborn child warring with the fire in his blood. She turned her face to his ear, lips brushing the lobe as she answered, "The bairn will be fine, my heart. He sleeps safe within me." Her kiss was gentle, then insistent, a promise that love could shield them both. What followed was a storm of passion neither had known before. Clothes fell away in quiet urgency, skin met skin in reverent exploration. Their joining was fierce yet tender, a claiming that spoke of shared trials, unspoken vows, and the deep, unbreakable bond forged in hardship. Every touch, every sigh, every whispered name poured over them like divine rapture, binding soul to soul as surely as body to body. Afterward they lay entwined, sweat cooling on their limbs, the candle guttering low. William pressed his lips to her temple, voice burdened with profound intent. "I will provide for ye, Rebecca, for ye and the wee one. No harm shall ever come near ye while I draw breath." He drew back just enough to meet her gaze, then his forehead touching hers, eyes fierce with the light of certainty. I knew it the first moment our eyes met across the dock in Philadelphia. There was love in that glance, bright as dawn. God himself set our paths to cross that day, and he has planned this life for us ever since. Through sorrow, through separation, through the wilderness ahead, we go forward together, Macready, always. Rebecca's fingers threaded through his hair, her tears now ones of quiet joy. In that shadowed room, on the threshold of an unknown future, their love felt eternal, a flame no distance or hardship could ever quench. April 28th, 1787. The departure. The Robinson homestead buzzed like a disturbed beehive on that spring morning in Harrisburg. Doors stood wide open, boots thudded across wooden floors, voices called back and forth in hurried bursts. Men heaved crates and barrels onto the waiting Conestoga wagons, their canvas tops billowing slightly in the breeze like pale sails ready to catch the wind of destiny. Dawn broke. Dark cloud shadows on the horizon had the color of bruised purple overripe plums, then softened into a warm crimson and amber hues as the sun climbed from behind the Appalachians. Golden light now touched the trees. The birds burst into a dawn chorus. Sparrows stirred first, trilling and chirping in eager waves that filled the air before the sun crested. The air along the gravel road fronting the homestead carried the rich, loamy scent of damp earth, freshly turned by spring rains, laced with the sharp tang of wood smoke drifting from chimneys, and the faint, sweet resin of budding trees. A downy woodpecker hammered insistently on a nearby maple trunk. Tap, 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 its rhythmic staccato echoing the anxious pulse of the household. The maples and oaks had shed their winter skeletons, branches now swelled with rust-red buds, fat and expectant, trembling against a backdrop of rolling emerald hills that faded into the distant blue haze of the Appalachians. As the sun climbed higher, it pierced the lingering morning mist in bright spears, gilding the dusty backroads into shimmering ribbons of hammered copper. Low clouds clung to the hollows like whispered secrets, while long amber shadows from the farmhouse fence stretched westward, pointing toward the ridges as if urging the travelers onward. See what waits beyond the next rise. Every hurried movement thrummed with anticipation, hands trembling as they cinched ropes, shoulders tense under heavy loads, breaths coming quick and shallow. The wagons creaked under the weight of hopes and necessities, tools, bedding, seeds for a new life, the accumulated fragments of 2 young lives being uprooted. The night before had been different, slower, heavier with memory. The family gathered around the long oak table inside the house, candlelight flickering across tired faces, while others drifted outside to the fire William had built beside the open pavilion Rebecca's father constructed before their February wedding. The brisk April night nipped at their cheeks and fingertips, but the fire's warmth drew everyone close. Sparks spiraled up into the star-filled dark, carrying with them the scent of hickory smoke and the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts someone had tossed into the coals. Andrew, ever the practical navigator, drew William aside and lifted a sextant from its wooden case. Under the clear sky, he sighted Polaris through the small telescope, explaining the bowl on the Big Dipper always pointed faithfully to the North Star. "Harrisburg lies at 40 degrees, 16 minutes, and 11 seconds north," he said, adjusting the instrument's arc so William could see for himself. With the toe of his boot, Andrew sketched lines in the dirt. A globe divided into 360 degrees, illustrating how time and longitude intertwined. "Here in the colonies," he continued, "we measure our meridians west from Philadelphia. The British use Greenwich for their nautical charts, but for our maps, Philadelphia serves as the prime line. From there, Harrisburg lies, about 4 degrees to the west." He smiled, tapping the brass edge of the sextant. "When it comes to cutting boundaries on land, I rely on chains and Rittenhouse's vernier compass. But that's a lesson for a day when we've had less ale and more sleep." William nodded, absorbing what he could. He was quick with the geometry of barrel staves and Cooper's hoops, though the heavens were a different sort of map. Still, the lesson felt to him like a talisman of direction and purpose, something to steady them against the vast unknown ahead. Inside, the older kin and family lingered at the table, plates pushed aside. It was the first gathering like this since the wedding, and the air thickened with reminiscence. Aunts, cousins, neighbours filed in and out, sharing stories that drew laughter one moment and quiet tears the next. Voices rose and fell like a gentle tide. Tales of childhood pranks, hard winters survived, the wedding feast's joyful chaos. The fire's glow flickered light across faces, and the night smelled of pine resin, warm wool, and the faint, comforting yeast of fresh-baked bread from the hearth. Dawn brought the weight of final farewell. The Conestoga stood fully loaded by mid-morning, oxen stamping restlessly, their warm breath clouding in the cool air. Phoebe and Hannah emerged from the house with baskets of travel provisions, golden corn muffins still warm from the oven, hard-boiled eggs with shells flecked brown, slabs of smoked ham wrapped in cloth, apples canned with spices. The scents mingled, sweet baked goods, savoury meat, warmth and aroma filled the wagons. Rebecca paused at the threshold, turning for one last look at the homestead, the sturdy flagstone stone chimney, the familiar porch where she'd shelled peas on summer evenings, the garden plots already green with early shoots. William Robinson and Margaret stood arm in arm, tears carving silent tracks down their cheeks. Phoebe, Rebecca's nurse, her second mother, clutched her apron, sobbing openly at the thought of never seeing her girl again. Rebecca laughed through her own tears. "I've never been hugged so much in all my life." However, the moment came. One wagon at a time, the caravan rolled off the farm. Wheels crunched over gravel, then softened into the tall spring grass of the valley floor. The oxen strained forward, their massive shoulders rolling, hooves thudding a steady drumbeat against the earth. Behind them, the ruts left by the broad iron-rimmed wheels carved dark wake through the green, like a boat's trail on still water. Nan and Titus perched on the tailgate of the lead wagon, hands waving frantically until the homestead shrank to a distant speck. On the backboard of William and Rebecca's wagon, freshly painted letters declared a quiet creed. "You build what you can. You bury the rest." Beneath it, a smaller inscription. "May God bless my brother Thomas. June 24th, 1767. May 23rd, 1786. April 28th, 1787. Farewell to the Susquehanna. The late April sun hung low and pale, reluctant to warm the world it had only just abandoned after an unexpected afternoon downpour. The roads had turned to mud and muck. Thick river clay clung to boots and wheel rims alike, its dank, fertile smell mingling with the sharp green scent of freshly turned earth from the last ploughed fields. As the 5 Conestoga wagons groaned into motion, massive, bowed vessels of white canvas and iron-shod oak, their wheels leaving the Harrisburg cobblestone, now biting deep into the rutted track west of Harrisburg, sucking at the damp soil with wet, protesting squelches. A thin line of neighbours stood silent along the roadside, hats clutched in work-hardened hands. Slow waves like the wheat bending in the wind. No cheers, just sad farewell. Only the murmur of the broad Susquehanna behind them, coloured with spring runoff of dark tannins, made the river look like beer pouring from Hogshead headed to meet the ocean. The river was whispering its own reluctant farewell. The Ohio River would carry their dreams to Limestone, but for now the land itself would test them. At the town's ragged edge, Maclay swung down from his saddle, boots sinking into the softening ground. He clasped William's forearm in the old way, firm, lingering, the grip of a mentor, and turned to Rebecca with a solemn nod. "Fare thee well, William Rebecca," he said, his voice roughened from long hours of oratory and endless meetings, debating the fate of the nation and who would bear its taxes. "May the road lie easy beneath your wheels, and may the ridges show mercy." William met his gaze steadily. We'll remember every word of your counsel, Maclay. Thank you for the maps, the warnings, the loan of the extra team. God keep you well." With a lurch and a low bellow from the lead oxen, the train rolled forward onto what Andrew called the Pennsylvania Road, the old Forbes trace, still scarred from military wagons 30 years before. Narrow, flanked by budding oaks whose new leaves shivered in the breeze, it stretched west toward the distant blue haze of the Alleghenies, promising valleys at first, then unrelenting climbs. Rebecca settled beside William on the high wagon seat, the canvas cover snapping overhead like a sail filling with uncertain wind. Behind them, young Nan perched quiet on a crate, eyes fixed on Harrisburg, until it shrank to a grey smudge swallowed by trees. Martha and Samuel's wagon creaked close behind, its load swaying ahead. Andrew and Patience led in the foremost Conestoga, their 2 daughters, 12 and 14, waving farewell to strangers, while their 6-year-old son clung to the tailgate, wide-eyed at the adventure, watching the town disappear. Rebecca leaned close, her voice a thread beneath the steady clop of hooves and jangle of harness chains. "Andrew unrolled the map last night by candlelight," she confided. A day or two of gentle valley road to Carlisle, then the real climb, 3 to 5 days of steep grades toward Old Fort Loudon. "We can breathe there. Rest the teams. God grant we reach Redstone Old Fort in 16 days, no more." For the first time since the salt stink of the Atlantic crossing, time stretched unbroken before them, hours unclaimed by urgency, measured only in the wagon's gentle, ceaseless sway. The air thickened with honest frontier scents, oiled leather warming in the sun, oxen sweat sharp and animal, pine sap bleeding from fresh-scraped wheel spokes. They spoke softly of the cabin they would raise in Kentucky, log walls chinked tight against winter, fields clawed from forest, the new bairn due in October kicking already beneath Rebecca's apron. A life almost within reach, shimmering just beyond the blue ridges. Yet beneath that bright current ran a colder stream, one that belonged to Rebecca alone. It eroded her from within, a persistent chill born of stories too real to dismiss. The frontier was no longer a tale told beside a Harrisburg hearth. It breathed now in every rustle of underbrush, every shadow pooling too long beneath the oaks. Her mind drifted back 4 years, Philadelphia, 1784. William stepped off the ship with his brothers, David and Thomas, salt-crusted and hopeful. David and Thomas were bound for the Cumberland Gap to work for their cousin, Captain Robert Moffett, and to seek land in Kentucky. William, however, had made other arrangements. He was to learn the cooper's trade under her father's guidance. When Moses Trimble arrived, sent by Rebecca's Uncle James to meet David and Thomas, his face was carved with grim duty. The news he carried struck them silent. The previous April, on the 5th of 1783, Shawnee raiders had descended upon Robert Moffett's sugar camp at the head of the Clinch. In broad daylight, Robert's sons, John, 8, and George, barely 6, had been seized from the sugar-making fire. Barely a year had passed since that horror, yet its shadow still lingered in William's unguarded moments. Uncle James and Robert had ridden out in furious pursuit, but the war party vanished into the mist like ghosts. They clung to fragile hopes. Were the boys still alive, enslaved in some distant village, traded deeper into the wilderness, or gone forever? Moses brought darker tales from the Clinch raids, cabins burned in the night, livestock driven off, children dragged from their doorways, and scalps taken without mercy. Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, Miami, names that had once stirred only boyish adventure now loomed like spirits, circling just beyond the firelight. William's hand closed over hers, warm, calloused from Adsa and spokeshave, steady as iron. "They'll nae take you, Rebecca," he said, voice low and fierce against the creak of axles. "Nor Nan, nor the wee one." He patted the rifle across his lap, loaded and primed, one lead ball already warm from his restless fingers, turning it over and over in his pocket. Titus rode point on the old bay horse, musket balanced easy across the saddle, eyes sweeping the tree line with the calm vigilance of a man who had seen worse. The valley road unrolled gentle for now. Dappled sunlight, distant wood smoke curling from isolated homesteads, the sweet resin smell of budding pines. But every snap of a twig in the underbrush, every shadow stretching too far across the path, carried a whisper. The frontier waited, patient and hungry. They were leaving the settled world behind. Churches, ordinaries, neighbours within call. All they carried was faith, powder, lead, and each other, plus the quiet iron promise that whatever lay beyond the next ridge, muddy fords, broken wheels, or worse, they would face it together. Ahead lay Carlisle, then the long climb over Sidling Hill and the Tuscarora Ridge, the shadowed passes of Fort Littleton and Bedford, the final push past Ligonier to Redstone Old Fort on the Monongahela. There they would fell timber, hew planks, and build flatboats, broad, blunt craft to carry their wagons and dreams down the river to Limestone at the Kentucky mouth. A new beginning, hard-won and river-born. For now the wagons rolled westward into the green hush of spring, the oxen straining, the canvas tops billowing like sails set for an unknown shore. Titus rode ahead, eyes scanning the tree line, musket at the ready. The valley road unrolled before them, gentle for now, dappled with the fading sunlight, sweet with distant wood smoke from homesteads. But every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that stretched too long across the path, whispered of what might come. They were leaving the settled world behind. All they carried was faith, powder, and each other, and the quiet iron promise that whatever waited beyond the next ridge, they would face it together.